Call the meeting to order of the Program Review Subcommittee. And just for informational purposes, could we take attendance? Thank you.
Assemblymember Buchanan.
Here.
Assemblymember Hagman. Here. Esteban Almanza. Here. Kathleen Moore. Here. Cesar Diaz. Here. We have a subcommittee.
And we also have Assemblymember Desarian joining us today. So we have basically two items on the agenda plus public comment, but we will actually take public comment on the agenda items at the time we're taking up that item on the agenda. And the first is a discussion of a statewide facilities inventory system.
Yes, and then in that order, just want to give you a little update that we had planned on having a projector that would accommodate us in the meeting, but unfortunately we are absent of that. It's not functioning tonight. So we do have the handout, so the presenters could walk us through the handout material. Okay. And I will turn it over to Mr. Zian.
Right.
Okay, good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. I hope this is working. Previously, subcommittee members have expressed interest in exploring potential options for establishing a statewide database for all public school facilities in California. And to that end, we are here today to talk a little bit about a background on a prior attempt by California in the mid-1980s, early 1990s, relative to the school facility inventory, and also to explore potential SFI models currently in use in other states and currently in California. There'll be the other presentations. So a little bit of background on California's first school facilities inventory. It was actually a mandate by Assembly Bill 2743 that directed the State Allocation Board and the OLA, which was the name of our office at that point before it was changed statutorily, to create a SFI database, a school facilities inventory database. And the purpose of the database, as specified in that law, was to provide estimates of current and projected funding needs for K-12 school facilities in construction and modernization. So the OLA performed the following tasks while establishing this and trying to meet that mandate. First of all, it prepared a feasibility study in 1986 and initially contracted with Basis, Arthur Young and Company to install hardware, software, and custom develop the SFI database. And from 1986 through 1991, the OLA collected district facility data in three phases as follows. Phase one was essentially district-related information, 12 general questions such as, number of school sites you have and enrollment and that kind of stuff. Phase two got a little bit more in depth, and it was 16 site-related questions only, such as do you have baseball diamonds and parking and those kinds of issues, stadiums and what's on your site. And then lastly, in phase three, districts were asked 29 very detailed questions about the buildings on the site that had been identified on the site earlier. Actually, there was no building information in phase two, but the sites identified the various schools and the sites. So they asked information such as buildings, use, dimensions, and specific building components and characteristics of the building system. So it was very detailed, and that was the hardest part of the inventory, getting that information. So by 1991, the SFI database was up and running. It was established, and it had information on over 1,000 school districts, general information, and it had more specific information on 7,000 school sites and 70,000 buildings. The total cost to get us to that point early in 1990 was $1.1 million, using the equivalent of 3.2 personnel years to create the database, maintain it, collect data, and so forth. That's the silver lining. The dark side of the lining was that there were some issues with the data that we had in the database. And so early in the 1990s, the OLA, also the legislative analysts in the Department of Finance, began to note a couple areas of concern. The first one was that the SFI database did not have complete school district data to provide reliable estimates of the statewide facility needs. And this was as a result of, we had almost complete phase one and phase two data. Remember, that was the general and the site-specific information, but incomplete data related to the real meat of the inventory, which was phase three. We had only 700 districts worth of information on buildings. And of that phase three information that was a lot more detailed, 10% of the sites, when we did a cursory look, had 10% of the sites within those 700 districts had information missing. Another area of major concern was that the data that was provided by districts was not validated at the time, just simply entered into the data system, and it contained numerous errors. And to look at that a little closer, the LEO did a cursory look at the data. It looked at a sample of 37 school districts and found that the data on 62% of the sample was incorrect, so very high error rate. The OLA at that time tried to explain the main reasons for the error rate, and it was the voluntary nature of the SFI and that no extra funding was provided to school districts to provide that SFI data. The counterintuitive design of the data collection instrument, it was very complex, many pages, tended to confuse facilities people working with it. And lastly, the existence of the SFI system programming and data entry errors. So due to these concerns, the OLA tried to have an action plan to try to address that and attempted to review and correct the incomplete data that had previously been submitted. Secondarily, the OLA looked at the Phase 3 booklet, which was multitude of pages and a lot of data fields, streamlined it down to one-page form that essentially asked for a count of the room types and the type of rooms, the year the building was constructed, and gross square footage. In spite of these changes, the school districts still lagged in providing the information to the OPSC, so the data validation efforts essentially failed, and a complete database was never created. So ultimately, the funding for the first SFI endeavor was curtailed, and that was the end of it. So moving on to the next area is what's out there right now, and starting with California. California does not have, as I've mentioned earlier, a comprehensive school facility inventory, but what it does have is a very high-level but complete database of all the school facility projects that have been funded since 1998. That's the close to $35 billion in projects. So all the grants that we provided, we can provide general data on all those grants and what was provided in those areas. Beyond that, there's a smaller, more discrete sample of information of that SFP on new construction projects that have been funded since July of 2006. And these projects in the PIW, there's a lot more building-related information there. So we do have a subset, but that's really what California has at this point, absent any other endeavor. So looking at the rest of the U.S., upon a cursory review of other states within the nation, there are obviously a lot of examples, and different states have different capabilities, but what was quickly jumped out at me in looking at it in various searches was that California was not alone in any way of not having a comprehensive SFI or assessment system for its various buildings. And actually that was kind of the commonality out there in the nation. There were 3 states that in the cursory sample that really jumped out that appeared to have very robust systems in place, New York, Washington, and Florida. And what I'd like to do is quickly highlight their capabilities. I won't spend any time on the chart on page 7. It's self-explanatory. You can look at the 3 states' database systems, what they have, and the similarities. You can kind of at an eyeball see it very quickly. But what I would like to do for right now, for the sake of time, is highlight what I see as the trends in these 3 states for their school facility inventories. First and foremost, all 3 states have the authority to mandate regular submittals of the SFI information. Secondarily, the school facility funding is tied in all 3 states to providing the SFI information. All 3 states have similar site, building, and building system data in their SFIs. And all 3 states use standard nomenclature. So, if you look at one school district to the other, a classroom is a classroom is a classroom type stuff. So they're not called different things. So it's all apples and apples type comparisons. So you can, really look at the data and have a good understanding. All 3 states require regular building assessment data to be provided so that they can determine rehabilitation and modernization needs. And they also, all 3 states validate the SFI data regularly. So the information in these systems obviously can get stale very quickly if it's not updated on a regular basis. And lastly, all 3 states will not provide any funding without all of the aforementioned information that's required. So it's tied to funding, and that's how these 3 states make theirs work. I should quickly note that Washington is of this sample here, probably had the best system overall, SFI, and building assessment that I could see. However, they only have it for 40% of their school districts, and that's because it's tied to those districts that request funding. So Washington doesn't have a full SFI either, but only for the districts that have submitted for funding. So they are looking at possibly having it statewide, but to date, they're just looking at strategies for doing that. So moving on then to considerations, should the state want to look at and possibly create an SFI, there are some areas that should be looked at. The first would be, what type of school facility data does the state need? It gets into issues of how much detail does the state really need. We believe that most school districts do have this data. They probably have a lot of discrete data. But how much of that data does the state really need to make decisions on an aggregate basis for the entire state? Another area of consideration is how to capture the data. I mean, you can go anywhere from a web-based cloud-type system with standard nomenclature where the state's kind of overseeing it to some kind of manual form that you input data into and the state inputs it into a system, which is more archaic, and there's other variations on the theme. But that would be something to consider. Another area would be how to minimize the cost to avoid state-mandated costs associated with capturing the SFI data. So again, this kind of comes down to how much is done at the local level and how much is done at the state level. And, you know, that would obviously be an area and a good topic to discuss. Another area is what agency should develop and maintain the database. Should it be OLA? Not OLA, sorry, that's a slip. OPSC, that's where we are nowadays. The OPSC, DSA, or CDE, sorry, that was the comic relief for today. Or should it be some variation on all three? I'm not sure what the answer is there. How should the data be updated? How often? Should it be updated in the real time, weekly, some kind of annual basis? I'm not sure, but I can tell you from looking at the various states that had databases, it was a mixed bag there too. There was no consistency. And then how to ensure data integrity. Does the new and updated data, should it just be entered into the system, or should there be some test or validation before it goes into the system, or should it just be entered in and maybe validated later? Those are question areas that should be looked at. So if an SFI is established, then the next question would be, should there be the next level, which is a school facility condition assessment also to augment what's in that inventory? And if that is an area that wants to be looked at, some considerations there would be how often building condition assessments are necessary to determine the need for renovation, repair, or useful life expectancies of building systems. And again, more current data obviously allows for better decision making with the powers that be. How facility condition assessments, how would they be conducted? Should it be a standard statewide protocol or a decentralized local assessment that could vary in detail and scope from district to district? You know, we have over 1,000 of them in the state. Who should perform the assessments? Should it be school facility personnel, inspectors, architects, engineers? The answer is probably yes to any one of those, but you know, we'd have to look at what makes the most sense on a standardized type basis. And then lastly, how to minimize the costs associated with facility assessments. This would probably require simplicity and some level of standardization to accomplish that mission. So just some areas for consideration. There may be others, but at this point, that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
Member Hagman?
Thanks. Well, my first question is, how much data does the state have already? It may not be together, but between Department of Education, we know where the kids are getting funded per district. We do have the state architects that has some kind of semblance of records somewhere. We do have our records of people we funded. How much of that pie, if we got those databases talking together, would it be filled?
I can tell you that a lot of the data is there, and you're right, DSA has all the building plans. They have it, you know, automated. CDE has a lot of the school district information. We have a lot of the projects that have been funded. As far as whether or not the systems talk to each other and whether there's consistency, I don't know.
But I'm trying to figure out, do you start grassroots and let's say we come out with this new program and somehow we incentivize all the schools to do the right thing? Do you start from scratch? Do you use what we have for data as a backbone or a skeleton to start off with first? Where would it be the place for the most housing of that data to start off with? Obviously, as policymakers, we'd like to have that so we know what's going forward, the end results of that data. But I would assume most districts at this point would probably have some kind of system that they're paying for out of their budgets to kind of have maintenance and keep all the records together as it is. Granted, it's not a standardized system. So I think the difference between the 80s, when technology wasn't that rampant, and now is probably most of the backbones, most of the administration systems need this to kind of function anyway, to report how many kids they have per day and all the rest of the stuff they have to do with the education system. So would that not end up statewide, at least hopefully save money if we have a system that they all can utilize that would do all their needs, I guess. But I just wondered, do we start it here? Do we start down there? Do we start from scratch? What's the thoughts on that?
It's a good question, so member, and I think that there's different ways that the subcommittee and the board can consider as far as what's useful from the data that's available. It's one thing to have data in sets of plans, but extracting that data and what kind of data and what do you get out is something that will clearly need to be defined. But that is something that we can take a look at. Again, if there's an interest in moving forward, what is currently available, who has it, in what form, how can it be extracted? Those are considerations that.
And would you suggest, I mean, do you do a pilot project to see what available data is out there in a couple of different random school districts? Do you?
Oh, we'll have an idea probably by the time we finish this agenda item, since we have several districts that are going to present to us on what they're currently doing. Go ahead.
Assuming that the SFI effort that we did, about 15 years ago, assuming that it had worked and there was a low error rate and we had all this data, what difference would it have made in our allocation decisions? Would it have been incorporated somehow in projects that we funded?
I think there would have been more discrete decisions made. A lot of the decisions that have been made with the failure of the first SFI have been based on our unfunded lists, frankly. I mean, that's okay. A lot of it is how much do you have on your mod, how much do you have on your new construction list, and whether or not that's a true indicator of the need out there, I don't have a good answer for that, but I don't believe it represents everything that's out there. You know, and if there's program changes, then you really don't know.
Right, but what difference would it have made in regard to how this board allocated funds and the projects that got funded?
In terms of it, the qualifying criteria right now, it wouldn't make a difference because each district has to apply independently, and we evaluate each district's funding request to see if they qualify under the eligibility for a certain program. Right now, the way the Green Act is structured, there is no statewide inventory that is needed in order to award grants. We require individual districts' information for purposes of establishing eligibility, whether it's for new construction, modernization, but there currently is not a requirement that the state have a statewide inventory. So we still need individual districts' information for purposes
That's information that would have been nice to know, but not required for allocating funding for school facilities.
Not under the current
But
program.
it potentially could lead to better decision making. I mean, if you believe that data is important for driving good decisions, you have to have some data. And we have a state with 1,000 school districts, 10,000 students, roughly 6.5 million kids. And when someone says to me, well, you know, we've spent all this money in the last decade, aren't our schools taken care of, or what is the need? I can't tell you how many classrooms haven't been touched in 25 or 30 or 40 years. I can't match up projected growth data with on a regional basis because, as I told someone, you know, if I have growth in Bakersfield and capacity in LA, I can't send that child in Bakersfield to LA, so I still need to build schools there. And so, you know, where I sort of struggle with, and I think we'll have more information as the other presenters are, is I don't want the state to get into being responsible for what the condition is of every school in the state of California. I mean, we still have school boards, we have local school districts, and I don't think we could ever make a good decision to say, well, you know, we can't fund this school because this school has greater need and that school may not be ready to be funded, and getting into those levels of decisions. I would hope that each district, as it does a facility analysis before it goes out for its own bond, does its own analysis based on need. Certainly, when I talk to districts, I know that's what occurred in our district. If we had a school that hadn't been modernized for 40 years, that certainly took priority over a school that was 5 years old, and something that was nice to have. So it's hard for me when someone says, well, what is your need? Or, what do you need? You can't answer that question. And so I think having high-level data just on the numbers of schools, the numbers of classrooms, when the last time they were when they were built or the last time they were modernized would give us some useful information. I myself don't see us getting down into management type level decisions. I don't care about how many electrical outlets you have. I don't care about when the last time was you painted or whatever. Those are decisions local school districts have to have. But in terms of our program, particularly if you're going to divide, if you have a bond and you're going to divide a certain percentage into modernization, a certain percentage into new construction, whatever, it'd be nice to know, okay, we're going to grow by so many students. How are we going to manage that? What if that's infill? What of that is new developments going in? We've got schools. We always have some schools that are going to be turning 25 years old or older. What is the need there? So I don't think data is ever I don't think not having data is or the fact that you're going to ask people to report data is a reason not to have it. We just need to be sure that whatever we ask, that it's at a level where it's going to provide useful information to us, and we're not overburdening them with a reporting requirement that ends up costing money and provides data to us that we're really not going to use. Some of that you may use as school districts. There are there's information you may want to know when you replace the ballast last in your, and the lighting in your building. I don't really care on that. Those are decisions you have to make locally.
Well, and I would go one step further. I mean, think about the policies. We're talking about what we've done in the past and projections for the future. But what about current time things? We switch to the new Common Core next year. How many schools are ready for that? I know we've given out some money for that. How many are capable of even doing that? So if we go through the legislature and make these changes, you will have this reporting out by next year, and 3/4 of our schools don't have the capability of even doing it. Then, it has a framework to have that added on as we go forward.
But the question there is the CDE is doing a study on that, in terms of preparedness for districts, in terms of the number of computers and technology and all of that. So that you still get back into the question we'll have to resolve is how much data do we have them just because we might need it, or because, that gets to the core of the decision making that we're doing, so we can go to the governor, go to the voters and say, these are the demands we're going to have for new construction or modernization.
I'd offer a couple of items before we get into the details of all of this. We did look at this. This is one of the recommendations of our infrastructure investment report that we commissioned with UC Berkeley, was for an inventory. And we took it further in looking at the implementation of that. We brought together a group to say, well, what do you think is that top-level data that might be important to the state to have? And then how could local data feed into that? And maybe the locals need a lot more data at the local level, but the high-level data could roll up to the state. And I'll just provide you, the last page of this was the recommendations of our group. We worked with the Council for Educational Facilities Planners International, and a number of people that work nationwide. And I would say that also on this data sheet, much of the data that links to the CDS code in the first grouping of these data points is available in the CDS code, so it doesn't have to be entered by a school district. So as we talk about the conversation, here's a group of stakeholders that have looked at this issue and what might be high-level data that I think would be effective for the state. Secondarily, in terms of a possible pilot, we kind of have had one already, and that is that roughly 20% of our schools, the deciles 1 through 3, all had to report to the OPSC on a school facilities needs assessment that was done in response to Williams. And it was a facility inventory. It estimated the cost for 5 years to maintain functionality of school buildings. It had the remaining life of major buildings, and it had a list of repairs for all deciles 1 through 3 schools. And OPSC shared their data with us. It represented about roughly 2,000 schools of our 10,000 across the state, so 20%. And that is a possibility of looking at maybe a model as well to consider as we move forward, or at minimum, as Assemblymember Hagman said, it's data that exists today about deciles 1 through 3 schools that was taken at a certain point in time. Might need updating and might not be relevant to today, but we did go through this subsequent to the 1980s effort on school facilities needs assessment. And then finally, what I would say, having been a part of that 1980s, 1990s assessment, I think what we want to have that will be most successful, and I think one of the lessons learned that we had at the district level from that was, what is the data being used for? And I think there needs to be a partnership with schools and the state in terms of the data that's necessary for both parties to do their work. And that's why I say it would be functional to have detailed data that rolls up to higher level data at the state, so that the locals, are, and we're going to hear from two of them today, can roll up the data that they already have. I think that would make a more successful program than perhaps we had with the issues that were pointed out already with the 1980s program. Plus, technology has advanced exponentially since then, and I think it would be, a web-based system would be so much more easy for school districts to input data around. So, those are my initial comments.
So, in looking at the other states, when you were looking and comparing the budgetary structures there, how did they fund like the pilot program in Washington? How are the other states funding the inventories?
Washington used timber revenue and real estate lease revenue, which flowed into the general fund, and then it was appropriated out of their general fund. So essentially, it's general fund money. New York used general fund money to the education fund to fund this endeavor with their SFI and assessments. And I had an inquiry into Florida, and I never did hear back from them, but I'll let you know when I do hear back from them. So I don't know the funding source there.
And then just as a follow-up question, and maybe Kathleen, you can help me with this. When they did the deciles 1, 2, 3 and came up with 20%, do you know the estimated cost that was?
There was a portion, $25 million back in the day, to run that program. That went out to entities that were making the assessments. I don't know the details of it. I'm sure OPSC would have much greater knowledge of that. I just remember the top level.
Did all the schools report, or just those that want to participate in the program?
It was all deciles 1 through 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. The other thing in the research that was done, and maybe we'll hear later from Dr. Vincent, there were 22 states that he found that had assessments across the nation, and I'm very familiar with New Mexico in there, and they have 100% required participation in theirs. So it's another example out there, together with others that we may be able to extrapolate from.
The big difference that I find with California and other states is some of these other states' school systems aren't even as big as LAUSD. So it's the kind of information they're collecting is what a normal district here collects. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we determine what should be collected at the site level for their own decision making, which really I think is partly a local, and what we need at the state level, because the state program is there to partner with locals, but it's not there to replace the local contribution. In fact, when you take a look at the last decade plus, the state's provided about 1/3 of the money, and the rest has come from either developer fees or local bond issues. So we're not, I mean, this isn't a state where the state's providing all of the facility dollars and prioritizing in that way, and it's not a situation where the state is directly involved. We're a partner in it, so we've got to, you know, I think that information is useful, but we also have to distinguish the fact that California is very different in that regard.
Sure, I agree. And it's going to have to be able to work in our own state and our own culture. I know we're always scaling different than other states
Right.
in California. So whatever the problem is, we have to scale up because we have the most population in the nation. So that I think I think that's appropriate.
We scale up or we decentralize down, one or the other, yeah. Okay, so I think next on the agenda are, sure, yeah.
Sure. I thought I had enough of a loud voice, but it's not meant to be rhetorical. I just want to know for education purposes. First of all, is there a cost, and I'm assuming mainly it'll be indirect costs or any type of costs associated that would be burdened upon the state if we don't have the information? You know, wrong decision making, wrong allocation of funds to different districts, not optimizing the needs in other places. So that's one. And then if there is a cost, how would that compare to the cost of gathering the information?
No, there is no cost associated with the decisions we made. I think what Ron touched on earlier, it's first come, first served based on your eligibility requirements for the program. So it's just, we obviously have a limited amount of dollars to allocate as a result of the bonds that have been authorized by the voters. So there is no associated cost.
But at some point, we're offering dollars to the best, to the most ready school districts who are always advocating for dollars or trying to get these benefit from these dollars for their districts, as opposed to some other smaller ones potentially that may not be as well heeled to be able to position themselves. So that at some point, what would that cost be to the, or would there be a cost for that?
Well,
that's what I'm.
The smaller, I mean, when you look at the geographical distribution of dollars, it's certainly, I mean, the charts we get, they don't actually show up per student, because you'll see like more money going to LA, but then we know that's where, you expect more because there's so many more students. Your question, though, is what's the cost of having the data versus not having the data in terms of making good decisions, and we don't really know that.
I didn't want to ask it that way because that would seem rhetorical, and so I wanted to actually know if there are.
What?
I'm sure we can come up with enough costs that indirectly.
The real question, I think, that at least we're struggling with today is what is the need? How many schools do we have? Where are they? How many new classrooms are we going to add based on the best growth projections we have? How many buildings are going to need to be modernized so that we have, adequate facilities for our students? And then, how do we, assuming we have a bond, do we divide it up, and how do we get that balance between new construction and modernization? And then the question becomes, that we're not tackling today, but I think that you're alluding to, is what do you do in those areas where districts don't have the same ability to pass bonds? I mean, you could have an area where your total bonding capacity might be $1 million, and yet it costs much more than that to modernize a school. So how do we take care of those districts in financial hardship situations? And, those are great questions, and we've sort of, as we've met, I think, have some consensus here in terms of it would be nice to have some data so that as we go forward, because it probably won't be, we probably won't have it for this next bond, but as we go forward, we start to collect it so that we can make better decisions overall. I mean, it's hard to believe in the state of California we can't even tell you how many classrooms we have, you know, or buildings, and you know, and be able to answer some of those questions. And where we struggle is if we agree we need it, and we're trying to kind of build consensus around it, is what do we need? I mean, when you read the summary from the report, it's a pretty good list here. It's a pretty high-level, simple list that was suggested in it. But how do we do it in a way that we're not spending a lot of money for data reports that we're not going to use, but we get, you know, enough information to make good decisions? And how do we collect it? So I think our thought has been that should be part of you know, any kind of recommendation we have going forward. We're just trying to get our arms around it. I don't know if that helps at all. Yeah.
Well, and the last question, and this is fairly basic and maybe very naive on my part, but because this is the first time I'm in this committee, just interested to know. I'm assuming every school district or every county of Office of Education has some form of varying level of facilities management, whether it's one person, such a small school district that is only facilities is just a part of their portfolio of duties, or something like LAUSD where there's probably a whole building and staffers. So how hard has it been to get information from these folks who I would assume have exact information, and are there legislative opportunities to try to address that, whether through a carrot or a stick approach?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are levels of information, but it's not, again, required to be submitted to the state. So, I mean, you're right, they have it at the county level or the local levels, but unfortunately, that information hasn't transcended to the state level. So it's trying to create that bridge and trying to create what that next step is going to be is really, again, something that we're presenting, and see what type of best practices is being ushered out there in the field. They could probably share with you to some extent some of their examples of extracting the data at the local level, and to what extent, what type of information they're collecting. Because what they have in place may be different by using other systems. So again, I think it's key that you create some uniform standards of what type of information you collect. I mean, to me, that should be your base.
And then, if you want to even get even more in depth, is also, besides the basic list here, we don't know any of the status on the individual buildings on your list. Okay, it was built in 1952, but do we know it was remodeled 2 years ago and is something completely different?
Right.
I would definitely go with standardized naming, classroom, classroom 2, not have Jones Hall, because you don't know what Jones Hall means. And then, what's the use? You may have a brand new facility, but there's no students there. But you have application for crowding someplace else, so you don't know the use, the primary use. I mean, so I would add to those basic reports list to get any kind of useful consensus out of that of what the needs would be in the future. But it's a good start.
That's exactly the purpose, is to kind of lay out something,
Yeah.
and then have, you know, everybody has ideas about how it would function better. And I think also, as Lisa said, having that standardization, perhaps at the local level too, that they, you know, it's their local data and they're using it that way, but that it can roll up, so somehow it's standardized there, so it rolls up to us standardized. I'll tell you, we're also looking, my colleagues across the nation that are in my same positions throughout are looking at more national standards around this as well, so that we can report nationally, so that we can compare nationally, which we've never been able to do. And it's very difficult if you have all kinds of different definitions for things, as you're pointing out, Assemblymember Hagman. So we're looking at it as well. Whether we'll get there, in my lifetime, I don't know. But I think we're now looking at that and trying to be able to roll up data for potential federal funding if it were ever to become available.
Hold your breath.
I won't keep my fingers.
Well, considering today, that's probably the wrong thing to say.
I won't hold my breath on federal funding for facilities. Common Core is a pretty bold move. So can we move into the presentations then? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So we have San Diego going to present their information,
Great.
and we welcome Lee.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee. My name is Lee Delgroff. I'm the Executive Director of Facilities Planning and Construction for San Diego Unified. Due to our technical difficulties, I'll be walking you through sort of a PowerPoint that looks like this in front of you. I apologize to the audience there. You may be able to pull it up online.
There are any agendas, aren't they?
San Diego Unified is one of the large urban districts in the country. We're the second largest in the state of California. We're also a very diverse district. We represent some of the very poorest and the various wealthiest neighborhoods in California. So we're sort of a microcosm of what you probably see out there throughout the state. We're comprised of 28% English language learners, and 64.9% of our students are eligible for free and reduced lunches. I'm on the first slide here. We'll shift next slide. We have 208 district-owned sites encompassing 2,382 acres, about 15 million square feet of buildings, 3,817 buildings. 1,500 of those are permanent, and 2,200 are portable buildings.
Just to stop and interrupt you there.
Yeah.
This is the first time I had any kind of consensus of how many portables could be in a percentage-wise. I would never have guessed over 60% being portables.
Yeah, we actually at one time had 3,000 in our inventory, and we've been gradually.
Are these the wheel-on portables? Are they the relocatables? How?
They're the portable buildings are generally most of the portable buildings are permanent type buildings. They're built on a temporary foundation, like a treated wood foundation over asphalt or concrete, and they're connected to permanent utilities like natural gas, water, sewer. They all have.
So are they ones that have where you've built? I mean, do they have the attachable roofs, or how are they in terms of?
Most of the buildings were built to a custom spec standard for San Diego Unified, and they were designed to be like a permanent building, but they're on a raised foundation with a ramp. But they can be relocated from site to site. But it's very, DSA certification process now, and that have to be tied into the fire alarm. I mean, this happens sometime. Really, when you place a portable building on a site, you're really the cost of moving a portable building and recertifying it with DSA is. May as well build, yeah, exactly. And we're very grateful for the Overcrowded Relief Grant Program, that it's been instrumental in us building new permanent two-story buildings to replace a lot of these. But we also have some of the more typical portable buildings where they split in half and you can transport them on the freeway. They're
mobile modular type.
Yeah, mobile modular. Yeah.
One quick question: when you talk about permanent versus portable? What is the ratio relative to the number of classrooms in each? I mean, are these permanent buildings, do they have an average of 10 classrooms or one classroom, or portable buildings? Does each building represent its own classroom?
Oh, yeah.
Or how do you?
I don't have the exact ratio, but I can tell you that most of our spaces are permanent spaces. And, these are large classroom buildings that have, 10, 12, 15, 20 plus classrooms in them. Many of them are two-story classroom buildings. So when we have, to give you an idea, the district has 7,000 classrooms approximately. So if you figure that 2,200 of the 7,000 are in portables, that gives you your ratio there. And the average age of our buildings is.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure, you go.
And how many portables have you replaced in the last decade?
About 500 or 600 of them have been either demolished or replaced. Yeah.
So relatively small, okay.
There was a time in the state required 30% of the classrooms to be built in portables, and again, our district grew a lot during the baby boom, and our growth occurred all the way through the 2000 decade, and so we were, it was difficult to keep up with the growth, and so we employed a lot of portables, and now we're
Class size reduction came in and put even more.
exactly. We also had a single session kindergarten where we had 2 sessions of kindergarten, and that also changed. So, and we really believe that permanent buildings are the best environment for teaching and learning. So that's why we're
Right.
gradually, and they also are much more durable, easier to maintain, and are better in terms of, they're greener in terms of utility usage. Any more questions? I apologize. Okay, the next slide. This is just an overview of our facilities inventory system. So we use a software. We call the whole system computer-aided facilities management, but the software is Archibus. We use version 18. We're going to be upgrading to version 20. It's a client-server system with a SQL backend database, which means that it's pretty flexible in terms of interoperability with other systems. They offer a Web Central web-based user interface. So if you wanted to access that SQL data, you can use it to either go client server. You can get a web-based interface for facilities planning. So if a site wanted to see what their space utilization was, they could do that. The software integrates AutoCAD with the SQL backend of Archibus, and it also works with other databases. We also have a very extensive CAD and paper plan storage library. It's like a little mini warehouse. You actually have to go up on a forklift to get to some of the documents. We started collecting the CAD files back in 1994. So next slide gives you an indication of the level of granularity of data that we collect. So every building floor has its own drawing file, okay, and in CAD, and this is one of our. It was a user-defined decision on our part. Other database structures, you don't have to do that. You can see that our architects provide us with an accurate floor plan in AutoCAD, and then and by the way, these capabilities also extend to a BIM, Building Information Model system called Revit, which is another Archibus tool. Now the architects are designing with 3D objects, and so you can the same information is available and tied in through that. AutoCAD and Archibus allows the data to be synchronized between AutoCAD file and the Archibus database. So we have 30,000 room records that include rooms, not just classrooms, but stairwells, mechanical rooms, MDF rooms, support spaces, offices, hallways, closets, any space that's contained by walls and a roof, including lunch shade structures that have roofs. So, for example, we could do a report on the number of mechanical rooms and lunch court shelters. There are 4 data-driven fields that are linked between our database and the AutoCAD, the room code, type, category, and room area, and then there are 33 static hard entry fields that give you all the data. So if you look at this graphic here, you can see, like, for example, you see LTH Little Theater or Auditorium 1. There's the first auditorium in that building, Electrical Room 1. It breaks it down. The foyer is FOY 1. And how does this data gets collected is you can either get it through an AutoCAD file with polylined rooms, and you create the link. A person has to enter the room description or how it's going to be used. But and then if you didn't have an AutoCAD file, you could actually polyline a flat file. You could basically scan a flat file and create that from the same type of document from a hard copy. And then every year we'd send out we use this for space utilization planning. So every year we send out we track the usage of the classrooms and how they're being used, and we send out a survey to each school site and ask them to update the utilization so we know where the first, second, and third grade classes rooms, for example, are located in a particular school, which rooms they're located in. The next slide gives you an idea of how this CAFM information is used. Obviously, my office, Facilities Planning and Construction, uses this information, but we also have a school choice office. We have a demographics group that deals with demographics, so we're looking at enrollment versus capacity all the time. Charter schools, we have some charters with a number of charter schools located on district sites. And so information is used for charter school location, for example, for when you're trying to figure out changes in school boundaries. So again, enrollment versus capacity. Our maintenance operations group uses it. Custodial operations for cleaning requirements. School police services, they use the room designation for emergency first responder planning. Department of Homeland Security actually has our data, and they use it for their purposes. Our risk management, in terms of property insurance, you need that. It's important to have the square footages correctly. And also, I just wanted to draw your attention to pictures on this slide. This is an example of sort of two other purposes. One, we had one is a college career tech ed CTE project that was funded by this group. Our Hoover Green Construction Technologies building. So for planning those types of buildings. Also, the lower picture is a picture of our classroom technology initiative. So we have one of the largest technology initiatives in the state, or in the country actually, where we provided classroom technology to our classrooms. It's important to know where those classrooms exist, how many there are, and what grades they're being utilized when you're rolling out classroom technology. Moving on to any questions on the CAFM? The facility condition assessments, the next slide. And these are real photos of our schools here. You can see most of the deterioration that you see in schools is not in places you know, it's underground, it's in the walls. That blue portable restroom building was actually recently demolished, but that gives you an idea of sometimes some of the types of facilities that exist out there. It's our policy to collect facility condition data on a 5-year cycle, and this also these updates are incorporated into our major repair and replacement plan, which I'll get into. We use architect engineering teams with various disciplines to document and quantify the condition and life cycle of the major building systems. We use an industry standard Uniformat 2 for estimating, so all our estimates are standardized. We also have a priority system to help plan our maintenance and our major repair and renovation projects. We use factors like safety and code compliance, asset preservation to prioritize our projects. We've completed 74 campuses using this model, comprising 7.8 million square feet. And we also are able to take this data and we extrapolate this data to create a district-wide assessment, and because we have schools of similar age and building type, so the data can be extrapolated across the district-wide, and you'll see some of our district-wide projections in a couple slides. And we also do conduct Williams assessment. We incorporate that data. Next slide. So facility condition index, some of you may be familiar with this. This is a numerical rating system. It's a standardized system it's a worldwide standard. It's basically the ratio of the cost of repairs divided by the current replacement value of the building. And there's an association of physical plant administrators, APA. They have guidelines. And in their estimation, an FCI of 0 to 5% is considered good. Between 6 and 10 is fair, and 10 and greater than 10 is poor. Our current backlog or repair value district-wide is about $1.1 billion on a current replacement value of $5.3 billion, so our FCI is about 20.1% district-wide. I can tell you that we're also a member of the Council of Great City Schools, so if you, the nationwide backlog is $542 billion, according to the council, on a current replacement value of $1.3 trillion. So the FCI of the entire nation is about 40%. But these are rough estimate, rough estimate numbers, nationwide numbers. The next slide here. So how do you achieve good condition? The problem is it's a moving target. Building deterioration and inflation continue with time. So you put money in, and APA estimates that 2 to 4% of CRV is the annual deterioration rate. So if you just look at our just San Diego Unified's current replacement value, that's about $100 million a year in deterioration, and then we have inflation that's impacting the backlog of $1.1 billion. So that's another $20 million. Of course, the rates of deterioration change with the amount of preventative maintenance and repair that's being done, and that's really important. Actually, you get an increase in deterioration as you decrease your maintenance spending, and then climate and weather also are a big factor in building use.
How did you come up with your $5.3 billion? Believe it or not, that seems low to me for 200 schools.
It's about our total plant replacements. We're estimating about $350 a square foot for current replacement value. That's all costs, hard and soft costs. Yeah. So I mean that's based on what we're currently seeing the bid prices for construction and the soft costs related to design for schools. Although, and right now it seems like inflation is holding pretty well. I mean, it's actually a great time to build and renovate. But if we go back to 2004, and I've been doing this for quite a while, our inflation was rampant, and we were seeing construction costs go up.
Double digit.
Yeah, double digit. Yeah.
When I divide $5.3 billion, if you divide it by 200 schools, it comes up with an average replacement cost of $26 million, which just seems low by the time you factor in your middle schools and high schools.
And I'm also looking at, I wish I could get all my projects done for $350 a square foot. I've been harping on that all last year. Nothing's been at $350 a square foot for the calculations I had so far. But it should be less than that, actually. But
we just recently had a new school bid and award in San Diego for about $22.5 million. It's a 700-student school at 60,000 square feet. I don't know what that translates to square foot per dollar cost, but
what was it? 23 million.
$22.5 million hard construction.
But that doesn't include.
And that's not including soft costs. So if add another 25%.
And that's by how many square feet?
About 65,000, 60 to 65, say 62,000, I'd say.
But if we're 65,000 is 346.
Yeah.
But yeah, that 300, that doesn't sound, but like I said, what seems.
It seems low to you.
It seems, yeah. I mean, $26 million a school if you were averaging in middle and high schools. Maybe it's because.
You're right, and the high schools and middle schools are more expensive to build.
Over $100
Yeah,
million
yeah. And then you have to, and you also have to factor. This is just building, so it's not including land. So that doesn't add into the calculation at all.
Right.
But you're right, costs are going up, and when I talk to my colleagues in other parts of the country, they think 350 is outrageous. They're actually at this Council of Great City Schools uses a number of 204. So that's a nationwide number. I know in Arizona or Nevada you can build a lot cheaper. San Diego is not is a pretty expensive place to live and not an expensive place to build. You know?
We'll keep going.
Okay. Wear and tear and on school buildings is relatively high because they achieve a lot of use, climate and weather. So it's important to analyze in terms of developing a plan, analyzing all of these factors when determining how much funding you'll need over time, and then also factor in the district's own maintenance and repair budgets. One other thing that typically doesn't get thought of in developing a plan is when you do an ancillary, like an ADA upgrade of a restroom, for example. Typically, you're gutting the restroom. So for ADA, and that gets categorized in a different way. It also eliminates all the backlog repair on that facility. So sometimes those kinds of repair by replacement often don't get calculated into these types of algorithms. The next slide is it gives you an idea of what our plan looks like. From now until about 2032, when our bond proceeds of our 2 current bonds expire. And so you can see right now we're at a 20.1 FCI. By 2020, that gets reduced to about 10.4, and then we're down to 6.1 in 12 years. The total amount that we would need to expend to achieve and maintain that 6% FCI from now until 2032 is about $3.05 billion. Again, inflation, lots of things can happen between now and then, but this gives you a long, we develop these roadmaps to try to get from where we are to a better overall facility condition.
So could you talk a little bit, since we're really talking about a data system, what data do you collect?
In terms of FCI? Or in terms of we collect the total cost of repair of all the major building systems. So it's mechanical systems, we have architects that look at the building structure, structural engineers, we have electrical specialists look at the electrical systems. Basically, all the major components that go into a building are in.
So you have, obviously, in your facilities database, you have the school, you have the buildings, you have the usage, you have the type of construction, and then you have the more detailed information for you, so you know what kind of routine or major maintenance that is going to come due or be required by the site. And that you use locally, I guess, to manage your program.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. We look at it both from a space utilization standpoint, as I mentioned earlier, with the CAFM, as well as the
and the system you use was that specifically, I mean, you gave us the name of it here in terms of but that is a off-the-shelf system, or is that an off-the-shelf that's then customized for San Diego, or?
The Archibus system is an off-the-shelf system, there are some user decisions that you can make in terms of defining your data fields that you're interested in tracking, but it's an off-the-shelf product. We use other software products. We have a computer-aided maintenance management system called TMA that does all our work orders, for example. And we also use software to track the costs of building renovations and.
So you've got the Archibus system, which is an off-the-shelf system, and how long have you been using that system?
Since we've been using it for a slide about 13 years, yeah.
And so
13 years.
I don't know we probably wouldn't want quite the same level of detail you have at the state level, but in terms of the effort to get all your data input, or at least the high-level data, number of schools, classrooms, type of those things, how onerous was that?
It isn't. If you set it, once you set the system up, which is that's an effort in itself. but actually loading the data in. So when you have a new facility come online, like the picture you saw in there in the slides, it's a matter of I'd say about a half an hour to an hour of. So we have a person that's dedicated. They spend probably throughout the entire year about half of a FTE that just does this kind of data entry and the data entry related to facility changes throughout the district. Now, granted, that's after the system's set up and we've already got our library and everything. But whenever a new building comes online, that's the first task that goes back to that person. They do that data entry. They polyline each of those rooms and they categorize all those rooms, get them into the system. Then it's done. I mean, even a district our size doesn't have that many new buildings coming online. It's not a it's not a full-time job. There are room changes and so usage changes that occur throughout from year to year from the school district. So more kindergartners show up one year and we have to change our usage allocation on a particular elementary school because of that. Well, those changes are also incorporated, but it's really a half an FTE on our end and maybe I'd say less than a full FTE throughout the district.
San Diego has how many students? I know it's over
130,000.
130,000, so, which is far bigger. Any other questions?
Yeah. So are you the IT manager for the school
No,
district?
I'm the executive director of facilities planning and
You're the
construction.
facilities manager.
But I have a background. I have a master's degree in computer information systems.
Okay.
So it's part of something that.
So how would you envision a facility inventory system to account for every single school building in the state of California?
Well, I think there were a lot of good suggestions that came, listening some to the discussions.
So if you were the one responsible for that facility management data system, how would you imagine
I think I would try to make a tool that the districts could access, online, statewide.
Now, every
That they could use that would capture data that they would be beneficial to them. So it wouldn't just benefit the state, but they could use it for their own planning purposes, and that would be easier for them to buy into a system. So the reason why we've done it ourselves is because it was beneficial to us. We needed this information to properly plan and utilize our facilities. So a system that would allow districts such as ours, and you'll hear some other ones that are really good following me, to tie in our existing data into that system, but also a system that would allow the smaller districts or the medium-sized districts that maybe don't have a sophisticated tool to utilize the data and make it beneficial for them to show, that I think that would be the best kind of system, something that had a web-based front end so that you could enter the data that way. That way it would be sort of universally accessible,
So you don't think it'll be that hard to herd all of the 1,000 school districts into one database?
I don't have experience on herding I would imagine it's not going to be easy. I've worked with I try to support other small districts that call and ask questions sometimes. I'm a member of CASH and other groups. And there are districts where the superintendent's wearing a lot of different hats. And this is, I would be concerned about adding one more responsibility to those smaller districts. So it has to be something that's pretty simple and something that provides them with a tool to help them provide a resource for them. I think that would be my.
Half of your school districts have, 2,000 students or less. We have many of these small districts that are, the superintendent's also the principal or whatever.
Right.
I can't imagine it's that hard if you have one or two schools to say we've got two schools. You could probably walk the campus. You ought to know how many classrooms you have and how they're being used. I don't think you necessarily we're talking about having a real complex system. I find it hard to believe that a district can't report that.
Yeah, and I think that probably the reason why they don't have a system in place is because they can name all the teachers in
That's
their district,
exactly-
and
that's right.
they know where
and they
they
don't-
probably can name most of the
Right,
students.
and they don't have the same
Yeah.
sort of, they can tell you when the heater was last replaced or whatever. But, you know, if they're going to participate in a program, for us, it's you know, it's useful to know how old our schools are.
Can I ask you, since you've been doing it for a long time now, 13-plus years, I can imagine initially it took some manpower to put the data in the system. But since you got it ongoing, you say it takes you maybe a full-time person a year to keep things going, you know, half-time at district, a quarter time at the school level. How much time, I would guess, it probably saves in certain time periods with planning and the other administrative duties you have, since you have the database at your disposal? Would you say it'd be a net gain or net loss for you with the database system that you utilize now, as far as time and resources?
It's definitely a net gain. We wouldn't do it if it wasn't. It saves, and there are so many times that we get asked questions, and it's not just asking questions. It's not just media questions. It's trying to figure out, you know, where empty spaces are, how we can best utilize the facilities. I mean, so it really is a time saver in a lot of different areas. Everything from real estate to risk management to security to, I mean, it touches a lot of different areas, this data, and so because of the time savings, it's well worth it for us.
Thank you.
I just have a follow-up question on the same vein, Lee. Do you utilize that data before your board to make decisions on where you're going to expend facility dollars?
Yes, yes. I mean, I bring this facilities plan to the board every year to talk about our maintenance plan and our capital facilities outlay. And this information, we couldn't provide them with accurate information to make decisions if we didn't have a lot of this information.
And one other question, one observation, it seems like it's going to take you 12 years to get to good condition, right?
Yes.
Is that, if I'm reading your information correctly, with quite an investment as well. So you obviously were starting from a place that needed assistance over time, and it looks like you're also looking forward into the future of what it takes to maintain that investment. Correct? Is that your $3 billion?
That's
into
correct.
The future?
The $3 billion is we've been very fortunate. We passed during my tenure. This is my third capital bond, but we have two active local bonds: $2.1 billion bond and a $2.8 billion bond. And not all of them. Some of the money is going to classroom technology and a lot of different other areas, and growth. But you know, a big chunk of it is renovating and restoring our neighborhood schools. And so that's what this plan sort of represents, how to get those schools back to a good condition in all the neighborhoods.
And then my final question is just wearing your information systems hat, do you see systems, or have we evolved to the place where systems can easily talk to one another? And I guess the reason I ask the question is, if we set up something at the state, do you see that you're able to write a system that would then dump your information into whatever that is? Or will that be a very necessary, important link between a potential state inventory and the locals?
We are at a place where it's pretty easy to connect database systems, but I mean, in other words, it can be done. It's not always as easy as you'd think. I mean, we have a district-wide financial database that ties into our facilities financial database, and making that connection it was difficult. It's mapping fields, so it's possible, but it's not. If you standardize it across the state, I think, and pick the standard fields that you're looking for that can be mapped, and the districts can track the data that you're looking for in those specific areas, I think it would be relatively easy for districts like ours to send you, to either send updates, possibly even connect the databases real time. But certainly connecting using a flat file dump and mapping those
Districts
two.
do some of that in other areas now,
Yeah.
because I know we did on some of the other reporting that we have to do, which actually in some ways makes it easier. I mean, the other thing is I was thinking exactly what Ms. Moore did in terms of going to your board and saying, this is our major maintenance plan. It's very easy to say, this is why we have the priorities. And for a board member, it makes it, when they say, well, why is this school getting money and ours isn't, it's because you can say this school is 10 years older or whatever, it has, these are the needs compared to ours. I would also think, though, for when you're going out to your community, when you're dealing with your bond oversight committee, you're going out to your community, being armed with data and being able to demonstrate, look, we have a third of our schools are 30 years old or older or whatever. It makes it much easier to communicate with the editors of your local papers, you know, your chambers, your community members in general, so they understand exactly, you know, why you're asking for dollars.
You know, you hit the nail on the head. It's precisely that. You know, when you have this many schools, there's always someone that says, I should be at the front of the line. And if you have real data to show exactly where you are in line in terms of facilities condition, then you can, the board, and so we got our board to support this worst first in terms of approaching, you know, and so that really helped because it eliminates a lot of the politics because, you know, our board members represent sub-districts. And so, you know, that it really helped, and they all got behind that worst first approach, and it enabled us, solved a lot of those kinds of discussions between, you know, one school and another.
So we need to move on, but I guess I would just applaud what you're doing and ask you at your convenience, I don't know if we have extra copies of this, but to take a look at what some of the data items were suggested that we would include, because clearly we don't need the same level of detail you do at the state level. We're not trying to build that level of a database, but we are trying to give us a very high level for our decision making. If you could kind of take a look at that and give us feedback at your convenience, you could just send us an email or whatever is easiest for you in terms of, you know, any opinion you have about fields similar to this where we would be collecting the data and any problems it might have. As I take a quick look and I look at yours, it seems like it would be a simple upload for you, but I don't know. But it'd be great to get any, you know, just feedback on that because, again, we're not making the decisions at the level you are. We're making much higher level decisions there.
What do you pay for the licensing per year, roughly?
You know, I don't have the answer to that, but I can certainly get back to you, Assemblymember Hackett.
Okay, thanks.
And I will take a look at that.
Yeah, that would be great.
I'm happy to comment on that for you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, I just want to thank you for coming all the way up, and thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing all this information.
We really appreciate the work of this group, and we appreciate your advocacy for better school facilities. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a piece of cake compared to it. I think, do we have, is Ellie coming up now? All right. So now we've moved from one of the largest in the nation to the second largest in the nation.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Roger Finstad. I'm the Director of Facilities Maintenance and Operations for Los Angeles School District. This is Bill Warrett. He's the Chief of Staff for our facilities.
Thank you.
Roger.
I'll be the primary talker, and when I stumble, Mr. Warrett will come to my rescue. Let me know when you're ready.
This one, should we switch seats maybe?
You're fine. The small mic is what records your comments for us, so I think
Okay,
that's all
so
we're.
this one.
Good, go for it.
You're
Go ahead.
We ready? Well, thank you for inviting us to come up here and allow me to talk to you about a subject that I'm personally passionate about. I've worked for the Los Angeles School District a long time in their maintenance and operations department. And we've just embarked on a facilities condition assessment program. And we're in it for the first year. It's a 2-year effort, and we're starting to see some very important and valuable information come out of it. So, as you noticed, I'm the Director of Maintenance and Operations. I'm not the facilities executive. I've crafted this program for a very specific purpose for LA Unified. A lot of what we would talk about is very similar to what our friends in San Diego mentioned. We're building our system similarly. But the scope and scale of LA Unified is huge. We've had a big building program. We've added to our inventory of classroom space probably about 15%. And in the last 5 years, our general funding for the support of the repair of those facilities has been cut by 50%. So for us to be able to articulate need, it's critically important. It's easy to say, yes, there's a lot of things broken out there at the school district, so let's talk about what the latest shiny thing that we should go out and pursue with our programs. So this program of condition assessment allows the maintenance folks to come to the table and start to clearly articulate what needs are. And with that, I'd like to just get into the presentation to show you the inventory that we have in LA Unified. We have 89 high schools, 87 middle schools, 540 elementary schools, 178 continuation schools, early ed centers, things like that. Over 12,700 buildings, 894 separate distinct sites, almost 71 million square feet. The average age of our buildings is over 52 years old. Our district encompasses 560 square miles, and we touch or fully encompass over 31 cities. The next slide gives you a bit of a profile of the square foot by building
Can I ask
age.
one quick question? When you say over 50 years old, that doesn't mean, is that from when they were built or when they were last updated?
When they were built.
Okay.
And you'll see this next slide actually does a good job of breaking that down a little bit.
Right.
So you can see that we have a large segment of our building population that's over 40 years old. So our effort consists of focusing on validating what we have at our sites, both with the buildings, with the spaces within those buildings. And then from the spaces, we go in and assess the components within those spaces. And what we're measuring is the remaining life cycle for each of those components. We use a CAFM system to upload our information into. As was mentioned previously, CAFM is a geo-referencing software system that allows us to make a database out of our spaces and align it to all kinds of mapping applications. We'll be able to develop a FCI table by schools. The information that we collect will be able to be used for other efforts such as master planning, energy audits, things like that. And we're doing our survey with in-house staff because we had local bond funds available and we were facing a tremendous reduction in our in-house workers. We're able to allocate the dollars to do this to keep these people on board, align their survey duties along with their trade skills. We've allocated $13 million to do this. We expect it to take about 2 years. We think that breaks down to about 20 cents a square foot, and we think that's a good price for a level 3 facilities condition assessment where we go into the actual space. This is just how we've broken down our teams when you go to the next slide. And so the teams consist of 7 primary surveyors, and so for each of those different colored geographic areas, these surveyors will go through each of the schools within that area. And then we have certain team members that go district-wide just because their skill sets don't need to be as broken down as far as the others. In addition to these teams, we have 6 people that provide data support and leadership. So we have about 60 people assigned to this effort.
What are the hand graders? Hand
Great
grader?
question. Yeah, we get that all the time. They do the asphalt installation.
Oh, okay.
So they're the grading and paving types.
Okay, perfect. All right.
So go to the next slide. This is just this is an example of a school site and the information that CAFM contains for us. So these align with the plans that we have for the school sites. And so we take those as our starting point, and as we go through the survey process, we validate, whether buildings are there or not, and then the spaces within the buildings. CAFM is a great tool. It allows us to layer other information on top of these plans for future purposes. We do a HERA surveys. We know where our, say, asbestos-containing materials are, so we can for other planning purposes, we can layer those locations on top of the CAFM site plans. Next slide is, through our process, what we do is then show through redlining the changes that we found when we went out and surveyed the site. And in this case, you'll see that we've identified additional spaces that were contained in these buildings that weren't previously identified. The spaces are labeled both as far as their function, and also they have unique numbers, so we can always trace back to that particular space.
Are you saying like lots of storage space was additionally created?
Well, to be honest, it was probably missed in the original import of the planning. It probably just did not go to that level. But there are cases where, classrooms have a wall built, and so now there's 2 rooms instead of 1. Next slide shows you just a sample of the information. And again, this is a particular building at a particular school, but we validated where it's at, the type of building it is, how it's being used, its square footage, the year that it was constructed.
So that portable was constructed in 1953?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Amazing.
I'm looking on this in a percentage left, so to speak. How do you gauge percentage left of an exterior window or grade or something like that? I mean,
Oh, yeah, that's a great question.
I mean, how do you say it's 25% or 75% or 90% or?
So I have that as a challenge further on in the presentation. I can answer your question now, or if
Okay.
we go through
No,
it,
no, I'll wait.
I can go into that in a little bit of detail, Ben. So you can see that we validated the site attributes as well, the site acreage, how many permanent, how many portable buildings, all the square footages, the average age of these buildings when the site opened. When we survey, we are taking the component information and putting it into the Uniformat 2 organization scheme, which our friends in San Diego mentioned as well. So that's a pretty universal way of cataloging your information. It falls within 7 major group categories, but then we take it all the way down to a sub-element category. So we actually record each air conditioner and heater and et cetera in each and every classroom and space.
I'm sorry, just another question. I hate to keep interrupting, but when you go through that much detail, I'm trying to remember, I mean, how accurate, you have a large school district, how easy is it to find your files? When's the last time you put a new roof on a particular building, much less a campus, or when's the last time that air conditioning has been worked on? Do you go back that far in your records? Is there enough of those type of records to assemble this kind of data when you're doing percentage left and all?
So it's a great question, and on an ongoing basis, that's going to be a challenge to keep this information current. So
But even if your initial database, how accurate were your school district records to figure that out?
for things like air conditioners and any type of equipment that has equipment label, we can take the information from that, and we will often be able to get that pretty accurate. Other systems, such as floors and, as you mentioned, windows, that's going to be a challenge. So the next slide just shows an example of what our data collection screen looks like. And so we're really high-end at LA Unified. We put this information in an Access database. And it's a customized screen, and so we limit, just for accuracy, the amount of information and the variables that can be put in. As we went through this effort, we were getting a lot of outliers in the data, and when we went back and scrubbed it, did our quality control, we went back and were able to make changes to the data entry screen to help cut down on the types of errors we were getting. But this information does not stay in the Access database. You'll see it goes up into an Oracle database for larger reporting purposes. This is simply for the data collection effort. Important for us to point out that we've identified a library of 700 components. These are possible components that can exist in the spaces, and that's what we are out there gauging the remaining service life for. Next slide. This is just a sample of the kind of reporting and the data that we have at the building level. And so, as you can see, we have a component ID, the name of the component, its uniformat information, the quantity, the frequency. In this case, a weighted average for remaining service life. And the buildings can have flooring in different rooms, so we have to weight the average of the remaining service life when they cover more than one space. And then the replacement costs, we use both RS means, but we also have a team of estimators on staff at LA Unified, so we can use latest bidding information as well to update our estimated costs. And the next slide is much greater detail and also at the space level. And so, again, identifying the components as an example for a particular space. We can use this information to, get a fine target on types of programs that we may want to go out and pursue. Next page is an example of a survey sheet that our surveyors will use as they go out. This particular one is crafted for a room survey. They would normally have about 10 different survey sheets for each classroom that they would go through. And then it's a pretty simple process where they would identify the quantity of the particular component, and then they would assess the remaining service life. This sheet then gets turned over into a data input process.
I should just leave this on. It's subjective. There's a lot of subjectivity in there, too. So if we were going to do a standardized system, the conclusion would be we would have to come up with some kind of scale that would be somewhat universal, and we wouldn't probably want this much detail anyway. We probably want a percentage of.
No, I think we want the high level. They need.
Yeah, they need this. But our system, sorry, I'm kind of jumping to conclusions, but if we were to build a system that would be useful to school districts that didn't have their own system like this, they may want to have the modules that they could reach, but we would not need to analyze that kind of data. But if you start comparing apples and apples, the apples are going to be defined the correct same way. So even if they have the human error looking at the window life of 75%, it may be different for each one of your surveyors too.
As a policymaker, I think this is a huge amount of data. But as a M&O director, this is great stuff. I, like it very much. And just to go to your point, we do weekly trainings of our survey teams. And so what we've done is created catalogs with photos and the conditions that we assign to those. We have it posted on a blog that these teams can go and download the latest information, and it can show what the component name should be. It can show, this is a condition with, a certain remaining service life. So we use these tools to help us standardize the kind of information across so many teams of people.
It's actually interesting. One thing that Roger had his team do as early in the data collection effort, it started to become obvious that different teams were faced with this same issue, Assemblyman Hagan, that you just brought up. One person would say that this has 20% of its life left, and another person would say that the same thing has 50% of its life left. So he had each team go to the same building on a different day and collect the same information on the same components, and then use that as a training tool to infuse consistency.
Debrief all the team members, let them show how each of them did it, and then have them go forward from there. So we have a pretty robust.
And Bill, what would you say? How would you grade that over for the whole, if you made a statewide system?
Well, I'm not sure we're going to, I think we want a set of uniform standards and criteria at the state level too, but we want it to be at the very highest level, because that's really what's going to matter for us. But we have to try and get it as uniform and as standard so that everyone can report up in the same type of information. And we'll probably have some of the same hiccups that they have too. We'll do trainings also.
I'm just trying to see if we had to go down and move the microphone each time I ask some of the different questions. So I was going to work on one next, but that's okay.
It sounds like at a state level, you'll want information like what you see on slide 8, but you'll also want to have some measure of the condition of the facilities, and that'll be the challenge to determine exactly what makes sense.
And I'm not sure we want condition. I think we may want age, using as a proxy, because if not, we'd have to have statewide training so that everyone evaluated condition the same. I think condition is something you need to deal with locally. But we tend to have criteria, because we have to balance whether or not we want to create a whole other level of bureaucracy on this data, when really most of what's done is at the local discretion of the local superintendent and the local board. Most of the money you get for maintenance, you make those decisions. More money is provided through local bonds and developer fees than is provided by the state. We want to be a partner. So I'm not sure we want to create something that big at the state level, but I do believe we need something.
I don't think the one thing I would clarify, though, you can't just go by age, because if it's 70 years old, but you just remodernized it 10 years ago, you may be 80% condition level, and you built a building that was poorly constructed and fallen apart, and it's 20 years old.
That's where, if you have a program and you say, okay, we provide modernization funds every 25 years, at the local level, you've got to decide what quality of construction you want, because you can't come back to the state for 25 years.
Yeah, I think this needs to be a minimum number of years.
If we want to fund portables, we keep having that discussion. And then from there, I don't know how we get into a real detailed condition assessment in every single district and compare one to the other.
I was just remembering the federal level where they had the A through F function. If we could somehow get a very simplified system and say we only have X amount of funds to go to modernization, we're going to tackle all the Ds in the state first before we move the Cs or Bs.
But then you're assuming that at the local level, they're going to pass bonds and they're going to have the same priorities you do. And at the federal level, they were just starting to roll it out, and they couldn't get all the information. And so, if you create too big of a mandate, then you're not going to even get anything through. Like I said, right now, we can't even tell you how many buildings and classrooms and the age of those that we have. So we've got to decide where we want to start here.
How much does a license fee cost? You're one of the biggest districts. I'm just curious, a rough estimate.
For our CAFB system, I'm guesstimating it's about $70,000 a year. And it depends on how many users that we have.
Yeah, that's definitely reasonable. Thank you.
So going to slide 14, again, talking about how we're using and collecting the data. We use Microsoft Access to actually collect it, house it temporarily. We move it into an Oracle database. That Oracle database, we have programmers, they go into the back end of these systems and they can move data around. And so it goes into CAFM. We have a Maximo work order management system, and so we're able to take this data any place that we want to go with it. And the georeferencing capability of CAFM allows us to do, for instance, we had to drill to find how many classrooms were within 500 feet of a freeway. We were able to use our CAFM system to provide that kind of reporting for us very simply. As we talked about the challenges in doing this, the consistency and the accuracy of the survey teams was a big one. We did this effort for about 10 months, and then we stopped. We stopped for about a month and a half, and we went through exercises like Bill discussed. We scrubbed the information. We looked for we had outliers because we had lots of them, and then we also had to tackle the different assessment judgments of individuals. But we think we have that well worked out at this point. The data, though, also changes over time, as was pointed out, that we continue to do work on our school sites. And so we have to have processes, and we're in the process of building those to capture when projects and repairs are being done to those systems that we have in our inventory to make sure that we keep that updated. We're leveraging technology. We are making a tablet application for the survey form that we just showed you. We think that's going to give us a tremendous benefit in the speed of doing these types of surveys at the school sites, and as well as, again, improving on the accuracy of the information. And we need to continue to be innovative. The continuous training, the publication of documentation so that all your team members have access to it is critical. The social media and the blog sites have worked really well for us. So that's been
actually
interesting.
gotten a lot of activity, interestingly. Yeah.
Do you have much of your I assume you have on-site maintenance, janitorial, those type of service
On-site janitorial.
And they could do probably preliminary stuff for you as well. Probably not to really get in the nitty-gritty of electrical or plumbing, but they could do a lot of the uploads, I would think, just by on-site personnel.
No, and it's a good point. We need to leverage, I mean, our resources are, diminished, so we have to leverage every place that we can, and site-based custodial staff where they can help would certainly be ones that we would tap into. So the benefits of doing this, having updated facilities data is important for a wide variety of reasons. We have a whole nother part of LA Unified Facilities that does our master planning, and we work very closely with that group with this information so that they can see those systems that have, say, 5 years or less of remaining service life, or those systems that are already in a critical state. And so as they do the master planning for our projects, these can be incorporated easily into those scopes. Crafting a deferred maintenance plan. I'm expanding our preventive maintenance programs with this information. I believe it will have great application for Prop 39 and our energy audits, because all the utility consuming devices that we'll already have captured, we can hand off to our consultants that will be doing those energy audits. And then last, again, it was mentioned to you the FCI table. So this is the industry standard. We provided a table for you that shows what, for the 56 schools that we have completed this at, which is all of our high schools. It's about 25% of our acreage, but it's 56 of our largest schools. And they are probably the ones that are most heavily used and are ones that are in the worst condition. But this shows you what their FCI is today and what it will turn into if no investments are made. So obviously we have to continue to invest smartly and try to get our facilities in good condition.
Are there any other questions? So the real bottom line is both San Diego and LAUSD, you use off-the-shelf software that you can customize in terms of the reports you get or some of the labeling you do. It's not where you went out and had your own custom program.
And I've asked you the same question at San Diego. Do you think after it's all said and done, it's going to save you money, cost you more, save you time, cost you more?
So if I'm understanding the question, first,
Is the pain worth the gain? Yeah.
oh, absolutely. Just to be able to articulate the need has been just a huge benefit for the M&O part of the facilities organization.
And how many students do you have in LA Unified?
About 600,000.
And there's such competition over the limited capital dollars that we have. You know, everyone is making an argument about why their need must be funded first. This type of data helps the right priorities get funded, so it's critically.
So, Ms. Silverman, that's 1/100th of our state population, so that means she's built this whole program for 700,000 or less.
10%. It's 10% of our school-age population.
600,000, 6 million, oh, 6.3 million, yeah, so you should be able to do it for 70,000 a year, 700,000 a year. Easy. No $20 million program.
So I saw Ms. Moore push her
I
button.
just have a quick question. Have you had any researchers interested in, as you increase your facility condition index in your system, again, you seem to be about the same place right now that San Diego is, and getting to a good condition in 2028, are you looking at what impact that has on students' achievement?
We've started that conversation. We had a doctoral fellow that worked for us over the summer, and she did good work helping to assess this data and actually craft part of this report. And so we're in communication with her, and there's also others who have reached out to us with that very same question. And so we're expecting next summer to start some research into that very topic.
Wasn't there a report put out about a year ago that showed that in those schools where you had, and that was specific to LAUSD, where you had made the investments in upgrading facilities, that it had a positive correlation with student achievement?
We did
Wasn't
one
there a
in about
report?
2003, I think.
2003, I thought it was more recent than that.
Yeah, we would be interested in, as you move forward, and encourage you to partner with who those people are that are doing that research, because I
It's
think
really
it's
the $64 million question, and I think all of us would think that if you have good conditions around you, you will do better in school. So I think, yeah.
And I have one last question. So both of you have off-the-shelf systems and picked the system you did for different reasons. About how many systems are out there? And are they all fairly standard? I mean, it seems like, if we were to do something off the shelf at the state level, and again, I don't think we want the detail you have here, but do you have any idea how many are out
it's
there?
important. I think the CAFM, computer-aided facility maintenance, is a category of software, and there are many softwares. I don't know how to quantify, or I can't quantify how many there are. I think what's important is the standard, and it was mentioned earlier, the Uniformat 2 standard for collecting the data. Then it would be portable from one system to another. So I think that is really the important part. Decide what information you want to collect at a state level. Obviously, it's going to be somewhat high-level information, but make sure it's in a standard format. And that Uniformat 2 standard is one that we know that the Navy, we visited the Navy and learned from their effort in this same facility condition assessment program that they've gone through. And others, you heard San Diego, many others nationwide are using the same standard. So,
And could you maybe do the same for us as San Diego is going to take a look at the recommendations for a basic school facilities inventory criteria that was provided, and maybe give us any feedback or comments on it? It's very high level, and again, we're not looking to do the kind of reporting you are, but if you could just kind of give us any feedback on that, it would be greatly appreciated. Any other comments? I think we have one more system we're going to get information on from the community colleges, and theirs is actually not a off-the-shelf system.
And I was going to say, I would love to hear the opposing side, the people, if anybody out there doesn't want to do
We'll
this.
take comments
Okay.
maybe after the next one.
Well, good afternoon.
Bill, you can have your microphone back now.
My name is Fred Harris. I'm Assistant Vice Chancellor for College Finance and Facilities Planning with the Chancellor's Office for the California Community College System. I don't know about you, but I'm pleased that the projector's not working because I'm tired of PowerPoints. But I want to just use a couple of slides. I want to bounce around a little bit in terms of talking to you about what we've been able to achieve with our Fusion system. But to be clear, I'm not here to sell Fusion. We've heard a lot of outstanding databases and systems that are out there. I want to leave you with the message that as you structure your system, the technology is providing now, and this is more than just being in the cloud, technology is providing the means of interoperability for your data so that it could be highly useful in a variety of ways. And so with that in mind, I just want to use the first two slides of the presentation to introduce you to community colleges in terms of 72 districts, 112 colleges, 72 approved off-campus centers, and 23 separately reported district offices, 24,398 acres of land, 5,281 buildings, 75.6 million square feet, 2.4 million students annually, roughly 75 to 80% of the public higher education students in the state, and roughly 25% of the community college students in the country. Our 10-year facilities needs are $35.8 billion. Enrollment growth needs of 18.5 million new square feet. 27.3 million existing square feet needs to be modernized. 67% of our buildings over 25 years old. 46% of our buildings are over 40 years old. That's the end of the PowerPoint presentation. All of that data comes from Fusion. Relative to your table on page 7, 100% of our buildings have that kind of information, and that's what we basically can have X's in all of the boxes except for maybe the infrastructure between buildings. That's an area that we're still developing, and also floods and earthquakes is not necessarily something we've solely focused on in that particular way as Washington has. But again, Fusion is a system. It's roughly 100% of our districts are using it. All 72 districts are using it. We're roughly the size of, as I recall, of LAUSD square footage wise, 2.4 million students. The need for having a database is key for policymakers at the state level, at the local board level, and at the taxpayer level of why you're needing to make this particular investment. This particular tool that's been in existence since the turn of the century has been helpful not only for us to make an argument of what our needs are as a system, as I briefly presented to you, but also it's created a foundation, if I can use that word, a structure for districts to develop an argument locally for local bonds. And the local bonds since November 2000 with Prop 30, the previous Prop 39, districts have been highly successful in passing local bonds. 64 of our 72 districts have passed 1 to 3 local bonds, and there's probably close to $25 billion worth of local facility resources have been provided in addition to the state funds since 2006. There is a renaissance going on in the rebuilding of our facilities, but again, it's still a drop in the bucket in terms of our need. And to be able to, the reason why it's important to have a database for us at the state level is that we basically determine eligibility based on the information that's in the system. And so I would, as you have your list that you're asking people to look at, I would ask you, what are you going to do with that data? There's nothing worse to ask for data that you don't use. And so for us, we had ingrown in-house systems, before the turn of the century, the dark ages of, we had a space inventory system, and we had a 5-year plan system, and then we partnered, and again, that's been the seed of our success, is that we collaborate with public and private entities to basically fill in the deficiencies that are many that our system has in terms of what they can provide. And so we seek partners in that regard. We initially partnered with a company called 3DI, which is now Parsons, and they provided us, they had at that particular time a gold standard for doing facilities assessments and developing FCI scores that policymakers use. And basically, we were aiming to do a group purchase of getting as many districts on board to do that. I came from, the Senate Budget Committee in this building over to there, and so we tried to go through the normal state processes to get funding for this system. The first year I think we got money for a strategic plan, and then the next year a feasibility study report, and then there was a budget crisis and things crashed. And so I realized that we probably wouldn't have a system in place before my grandchildren were in college, if then. And so I reached out to 10 districts and said, this is the image of what we're looking for in terms of what we're wanting to do together. Not state imposing on you or just only a local-only kind of focus, something that could help advocate and provide key data, uniform data, which is key, a point that Mr. Savage raised in terms of having uniform, consistent data around the state so that we can go to policymakers and have the basis for making the argument for what our request. And I think it's been, we've had 10, 20-fold increase in funding at the state level, but more importantly, local districts have been able to use that formulation to whatever degree they can. Real basics in terms of, we have a team of facilities assessors. There are two. One is, to finish my other story, all of this is parked at our foundation, which is a 501c3, our official auxiliary for our system. And basically, I reached out to 10 districts and said, do you agree with this model of using what we're currently getting from you, but also expanding it with facilities condition assessments? And, if you do, I need $75,000 each from you. And I was aiming to get 10 districts to contribute funds in that regard for all of our mutual benefit, not just for the state benefit or their benefit, for all of our benefit. And it eventually had 17 districts contribute close to $1 million. So out of that $1 million, we've used roughly $750,000 of that in order to develop a real bare bones system. Again, I could say it's off the shelf. It was off our shelf. We had our space inventory system and 5-year plan system in-house, as an MS-DOS, ridiculous system, but it had the structure there. We partnered with, 3DI system for assessment and the other different components and came together, and that's where the word fusion came from. The term Fred's brain before, it didn't seem appropriate on a long-term basis to name this. So moving forward, districts, basically we got 100% of the districts to participate, both on the assessment and these teams of assessors go out in order to get that consistent data. They go out on a 3-year rotation cycle throughout the state to assess and reassess the facilities, and they're doing a level 2 facilities assessment. If you need more detail on all of that, I don't know, I think it's probably late and you're tired of detail, but if you need more detail, there's folks in the audience I can bring up to go into that. But more importantly, we continue to partner with folks and grow something not only because we believe that, community colleges being the lowest funded of the 4 systems of education, and again, we're not bitter about that, but, in terms of, the way that we get the job done is partnering with folks. And I would commend to you that the technology is here now for you, if you demand it as owners, to be able to ensure that interoperability. And the terms of interoperability that you want is web services based. This is more than just being in the cloud, but it's that ability to share data between systems and ensuring that your data is 100% and the systems that you're using are 100% open standards. There's a lot of folks out there who say they have open standards, and maybe, it's 10% open standards or whatever, but, the rest of it is proprietary, and you get lost and stuck in their garden like, the Google, Amazon's, Apple type of thing. You want to get out of that particular structure, have that ability to share the data. You decide what data you need. You've got lots of data locally, and you've got lots of capabilities out there, but you need to come up with an understanding of what you need to use, what you're going to use, and then have that roll up. But when you have this web services connectability, then once one database gets updated, it updates the other database. You also create layers of information in order to provide and make, value-rich decisions, not only for facilities maintenance, planning, construction, but also for things such as class scheduling. There's a whole host of things. I think economic development, forecasting, things that our districts do. These are useful tools when you marry it with an open standard system that we have for GIS, and you bring in Google Maps, you bring in a whole host of things. That capability is there, but you as owners have to demand open standards, 100% open standards. Don't get lost in someone's garden. I think the term that's used is, kind of an ecosystem. You want as open and web services-based ecosystem as possible. Now, a key partner that we've been dealing with, in the last few years is Onuma Systems out of Pasadena that provides a capability with middleware, a BIM Lite. You don't want to get lost in all the details of BIM, but the BIM Lite capability of bringing all this tabular data into visual format so that people can easily reconcile differences in the quality of the data. And, we just so happen to have worked out, again, as we reach out in our resource-constrained environment, reached out to Onuma Systems, and over time they've been working with us. And now they're beginning this month, they're offering their software free to our districts because they see the value of what we're doing, not only demonstrating this capacity of what a system can really work for in the built environment, but also it's useful. I mean, Onuma Systems is doing work with the Department of Defense, the Veterans Affairs, in terms of the Coast Guard, showing that this is possible. So, again, if I leave you with anything else, you want to have a system that's open so that you can have strategic partners. We invite as many partners as possible. That's what we're hoping, that you have these kind of standards, because as you grow and develop best practices, then we can incorporate them very easily and vice versa. I know Onuma Systems is working on a very beginning basis right now with the state architect to look at their tracker system. And again, this, I think the state architect gets it, and then the folks that we've talked to DGS, understand that these are things in a resource-constrained environment. We're past the luxury of being able to have standalone systems that are all shiny. We need to have this interoperability, and it's now. Your kids are using it now with applications on their phones, and maybe you're using it. I'm barely using some of those myself, but that capability is there at a very low cost. So roughly $750,000 of the million was what began the process. Every district came on board. We thought initially that probably 10% of the districts a year would be participating, but then I basically suggested that, I understand local control and honor it and respect it, and you too can choose not to participate in all this, but you won't be eligible for state capital outlay dollars. No one called my bluff, but, everyone participated. We got 100% participation the first year, and also we then had some scheduled maintenance funds through the budget that we provided to offset some of their costs to begin the process. Roughly $1 million a year, 100% of the districts since the early 2000s are paying in assessments to the foundation for support this. This is very bare bones. We don't have any R&D. So basically reaching out to as many strategic partners who can play in this ecosystem, be they owners or, on the private side, who can enhance this system so that, again, as I say, as you develop capabilities, that's our R&D. We grow all of that. So I leave you with the notion of Fusion is, to me, an amazing shared governance success story for our system. As you get into the details, everyone's going to have differences in what their system should look like, and that's fine. That's data that they want to use. Basically, make sure you have uniform data throughout the state so that you can take advantage of this interoperability. And part of that process in terms of collaboration is that we're more than willing to help in any way we can in terms of helping that effort. And because it's not only going to help you, it's going to help us, and it's going to help grow this notion of a very low-cost capability of having the kind of data that policymakers demand and need. That was my PowerPoint.
Very good. Are there any questions?
Do the districts have their own facility management system or that integrates into this?
Yes and no. In terms of this is an online web-based system, that was one of our things we always wanted, and so we're increasing that interoperability capability with the Onuma interface. I can't say 100% all of that's going to be interoperable because maybe their off-the-shelf stuff isn't open standards. But the data, again, you want to own your data. You want to be able to transport it wherever you go. You don't want to get lost in someone else's garden, and then at great cost you have to recreate it elsewhere. That's old news. That's not what is now. That's not the future. That's what is now. But for the specifics, that data is there. It's more about the data than the systems.
Right. Most of your cloud-based systems now, with your new companies, you own data. You own the data compared to the old where you pay them all this money, but if you want to report, you have to big bucks.
You have to pay the annual license.
Well, not only that, then on top of that, I mean, the state's been through that with some of the enterprise software that we've had. That all of a sudden you need a report or something changes, and you've got to wait 2 or 3 weeks and pay them big bucks to get it. So you know.
I mean, just as
gotta
an
be-
example,
you have to own it.
with you know the capability that technology is providing now, and again, I'm at the level of my geekiness on this, but that you can write applications that are very low cost, relatively low tech programs to develop functionality once this database system is in place. Kimona Numa with the Numa systems created a work order system over a weekend in terms of just through a simple app. In order to basically, you can on your iPad, iPhone, laptop, whatever, wherever you're at, as long as you have Wi-Fi connectability, you can get a work order kind of concern coming from one of your constituents in your organization and answer it wherever you're at. So I like that idea of being at home with my bunny slippers at times. But if I were to be doing that, I don't. I'm not at that level. But anyway, that's my suggestion to all of you in terms of this is doable. It doesn't, you have to decide what you need, and it's got to be something. I would suggest an integrated tool that could be beneficial also for the districts. But, if that's too much for you to bite off, so be it. You got to take the baby steps in order to get the space inventory, get the assessment information, because to me, the ultimate customer is the taxpayer. What are they willing to pay for? And I know in terms of when I went to college, the community college next to my campus was just being built down in Stockton. And I know when San Joaquin Delta came in with facilities requests, I kind of go, well, why do you need facilities? You have new buildings. It turns out that was 40 years ago. And they have the data to show, yes, we have needs. And I know I've heard that story again and again with districts when they do local bonds. Someone says, why do you need something for that building? They pull out their binders, they have this information, and it's in a translatable form, visual form for people to see at any given level of policymaking. And again, I count that as taxpayers as important policymaker in all of this. So thank you for your time.
And I had a quick question. Do you have a FCI?
Yes, we do. That was the result of the facilities condition assessments come up with an FCI.
Do you fund based on that?
We don't fund on that yet. We are doing a blending for modernization projects. That's kind of our next step in terms of based on that.
Thank you.
Could we ask you to do the same thing?
Sure.
Even though I know your community colleges and not
No, would love to.
K-12, but could you take a look at? I guess it's. Do you want me to? All right. Print Kathleen's no report left, but she could probably print them all off. That would be great to get any.
And so I
input
can
you
get back
have
to you
on
on this,
that.
right? You don't want to write this month?
Yeah.
Will do.
Thank you so much.
Thank
for your
you.
time. It's been a pleasure. So I think that's it for our presenters, right, on this. Is there any public comment on this item before we move on?
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. Joe Dixon, San Diego Unified Cash Chair. Cash supports a statewide inventory of facilities as well. As Mr. Zian indicated, since 1998, the state already has really good information, good records on permanent, portable, year built, et cetera. We talked a little bit, or you had presentations on condition assessments, and that would make sense. We think if the funding model takes condition into account in the prioritization of projects for funding at the state level. We heard from LA Unified, and I like their presentation, being a maintenance person myself. But their cost to do their assessment was 20 cents a square foot, so we know that's pretty expensive. So here's what I'd like to offer. And you've talked about it, and I appreciate it, all of you talked about it. Let's start with basic information. And DSA has basic information of every school building, at least since the Field Act, in the state of California. And maybe that's where we start. DSA also, Division of State Architect, has come up with a box or a cloud system. That's a pretty neat way to gather information as well. So we think that would be a great start, and then we could build it from there. It could go out to every school district. They could confirm whether it's accurate. They could put in information of whatever you would request as far as last time it was modernized, code compliance, whatever it is that the state would require.
Does DSA actually have that information online, or do they have the blueprints? Because somehow it seems to me that if we were asking someone to go through all all the plans for all this, it might turn into a monster.
Right, there's blueprints, it's paper.
There's a
thousands
big
of
difference
boxes
between-
of paper.
Well, if you get it from us, it'll be thousands of boxes of paper. It may not ever happen.
Well, some of it you may not know. I mean, I remember sometimes how we'd have problems with our older schools finding the as-bills for them. But at the same time, I think if we're talking about how many buildings you have, how many classrooms, it's probably not.
It's pretty close from their AB 300 list that they sent out to districts. Their information, I think, at least it's a start. We could build from there,
Joe,
and it's available.
Do you have an inventory of Santa Ana schools?
We do, and we did it similar to what LA Unified did. We did it with our maintenance folks, and we instead of having our maintenance people come up with the condition, we used the old deferred maintenance longevity list that said. So we make assumptions that air conditioning, for example, 18 years needs to be replaced. So when it hits 18 years, then we budget for it. Painting on the exterior, 11 years, et cetera. That's what we use as our base for assessment.
On this, Joe,
yes, sir.
You basically, on one hand, say you support the database system, but we should do it up here and use the data we have. Yet, I want to hear from a school district who can't afford not to do what they're doing right now in your district in LA and San Diego, where they're large enough where they need a tracking system to maintenance their dollars, which would be the complexity of, you could try to make the argument that larger districts are costing time and effort to do it, but I don't think you can function without that type of system locally right now. And the smaller ones, it shouldn't be that much data to add. So I'm trying to find out, it sounds like there's an impression we don't want to do this, it's going to cost us money and resources, but I haven't heard anybody say it's going to cost me. It seems to help their operations, help their scheduling, help their presentations from a staff level. So do you have an example where it is a burdensome versus a help?
Well, no, actually, I think inventory would be good. I will say I did a little bit of work up in the Central Valley area for a school district where they just simply don't have the human resources to know how to do it. It's different. It's tough. But again, if we started building it from basic information, I think take the old 1A plans and build from there. Perhaps if we can't get it from DSA, I think we need to ask them what it would take to do that. I think, Mr. Hagman, it would be real important to start. And I think small districts, if we showed them a model that was simple to start with, they could do that.
So when you talk about condition assessment and funding, I've asked this question from a number of different people, whether they're individual meetings or here. One is, what's been clear is you have to have some common language and understanding of what causes a certain item to be rated with a condition A versus condition B or C or whatever, right? And that's a pretty big task statewide in a state as big as California. But two, our program is there to sort of be a partner in the three-legged stool between developer fees, right, and local bonds and the state program. And we provide roughly 1/3 of the money. If we're not going to get into the taking over responsibility of facilities, which I don't think we can ever do in this state, certainly you want the schools that are in the worst condition to be the ones that are prioritized. But I assume, I mean, that's what we did in our district. I assume that locally in school districts, when they look towards their bonds or how they're going to spend maintenance dollars or whatever, they're doing their own assessment of needs. Is that not a good assumption? I mean, I would think they would be modernizing the school that's 50 years old before they put more money into the school that's 10 years old, unless you have an imminent safety problem in that school that hasn't been touched for 10 years.
Right. Well, capital facility decisions have now taken a different, there's prominence there because the deferred maintenance program is gone.
Well, I know, but we're irrespective, whether you've got a little bit of money or a lot of money, I assume that there's some decision-making going on with local districts. Maybe we need to write a bill but that where they are taking a look at age and need as they prioritize their money. Are you not doing that in Santa Ana?
Oh, no, we
Right. I mean, every
absolutely
district
do.
I talk to, big and small, that's how they're making that decision. So when you talk about prioritizing state dollars, if we are not in a position at the state level to take responsibility and spend, the kind of money that it would cost to do a condition assessment of 10,000 schools, and then do I not give your school money because one in Kurt's district is in worse shape? Maybe I have to wait 10 years until they pass the bond or whatever. How do you, if you're going to take that into consideration, how do you see that working? And do I wait till yours, if I can't fund yours because I'm waiting to fund his, do I just let yours continue to deteriorate even though the school may be 30 years old? How do you see that working logistically, practical level?
Yes, I think since 1998, the SFP did a really good job because districts would have to come in as partners.
Right.
And because the state's so big and there's so many different conditions and politics and demographics and, that you have to, it would be very difficult for the state to base their funding on conditions alone because maybe some district in Santa Ana, I can say this about our school board, they're rather sophisticated and they understand taking care of assets, and so we've always been fully funded for maintenance. But maybe another district in Orange County, another large district that I know pretty well, they couldn't because they had some other considerations that they had to take care of. But so it'd be hard, should we be penalized, I suppose, in Santa Ana, if penalized is the right word, because we took really good care of our schools?
And to what extent does the state get involved in saying, you can't spend the money on whatever? I mean, you've got local decision-making here in general, so to what extent does the state get involved in imposing those decisions?
I'm wondering, just hearing all the conversation about condition and the local accountability and local decision-making, if there's a way that, it appeared to me that that major districts are doing exactly what we're talking about. They are reviewing their schools, they are placing them into a facility condition indices, and they are ticking them off in that order. And I think what I'm hearing too is at the state level, maybe we don't want to be involved in that, but what it appears to me is that's best practice. That is best practice, that's best resource usage at the local level. And maybe what we can do at the state level, in addition to getting that top level data, is that we are incentivizing best practice at the local level so that those projects come up to the top of their list.
What evidence do you have that school boards are not taking a look at the condition of all their facilities and making those decisions today?
I don't have evidence of that.
I would say that even in smaller districts, when I look around, they go through a process in terms of before they're going to put a bond on the ballot or when they're going to spend the deferred maintenance dollars. They go through a process where they are assessing conditions. So if we have evidence that they're not doing that, but
what we do have evidence of is that there are schools in this state that did not receive any state funding. We have evidence of that. It's been brought forward to us by staff. So I think there's an element there. And so why didn't those schools get any funding from the state? And I don't know if they got it locally. So that to me is of interest because that's an equity and parity issue and for all students in our state. Now, it's still local decision-making. Right. And I think what I've heard today is I think it's in our best interest to provide that incentive. And I heard that maybe some smaller school districts may not be doing this. I don't know. We didn't hear from the Small School Districts Association, but maybe we'll hear from some that have rural districts. And whether we need to assist those particular ones in being able to provide these these types of reports. The other thing I heard is possibly an idea about getting the 10 largest districts together, seeing what their data is and how we might as a state interact with what they already have. There's the beginning of the building of your system, and you know, our largest districts probably represent, you know, anywhere between 17 and 25% of all the students in the state.
And you have enough small districts where you have 1 or 2 school districts where they may not participate for 10 years, because if you're on a 25-year modernization project, depending on where they are in the cycle, they may or may not participate. And that's over half the districts in the state of California. Does anyone have any more questions for?
One quick comment under LCFF. All districts, every school is required to at least be inspected and make sure their schools meet the standard of good repair. That is a requirement from the state currently. So at least we know they're getting inspected. And perhaps when they come in for state money, they would have to have a public hearing and a board resolution that they would take care of their schools to a certain standard, and they would have a condition index. And
Houston is
when they come in, you know.
I would question, having been a board member, you still are weighing the general fund side of the budget to the facility side. And for all of you here who only are concerned with the facility side, you know, for me to make a commitment where I've got to spend 20 or 30% of my budget to maintain them to a certain level, I would devastate the operational side. So you've got to be very careful in terms of how you're balancing all of that.
I agree.
But didn't we establish the level? We said it's a level of good repair. I mean, all districts are under that now.
Well, depends on how you define level of good repair.
4 walls that are rough.
Because if you're going to maintain that, if you just asked a district to put aside 1% of the value of its schools a year, I guarantee you would have a devastating impact on the general fund side of the budget. We do not fund schools at that level.
Thank you.
Okay. And then we'd have lawsuits. We're not doing it.
Good afternoon, subcommittee members. My name is Brandon Kitagawa. I'm with an organization called Regional Asthma Management and Prevention. And I'm here today in part to present you with some comments from some public health organizations. I think increasingly the public health community recognizes that the policies that have the biggest impact on our health are not made by health departments, but they're made in policy committees like this one. And I think we're likely to see greater improvements in health when we look at all policy decisions through the lens of health. And I think we're particularly encouraged by this subcommittee's careful review of the existing program, and particularly of today's discussion around an assessment and the questions of to what extent quality assessment is involved in that. And I think some of the questions that were just asked are really important ones, and to try to figure out how to enact a state policy that will have an impact on people's health. And so how can we maximize that? And I think we wanted to offer ourselves as a resource to help you figure out these very questions that you're asking.
Thank you.
Make sure I make a graceful entrance and not trip. Good afternoon, subcommittee members, Madam Chair. I'm Jenny Hanna. I'm with the Kern County Superintendent of Schools Office from Bakersfield, California. And I represent County Office of Education as well as 47 school districts ranging from 37,400 students to the smallest 8 students. And I'm going to compare myself to San Diego because I think it's an interesting compare and contrast in talking about how this relates to what the large school districts do in comparison to what a group of a county our size and the number of school districts that we'll be dealing with in terms of an inventory. But we have 178,300 students in our county compared to San Diego's 132,000 students. we have 47 districts in that count, and the number of school sites that we have is 273 compared to 223 of San Diego. So we're a little bigger than San Diego. Wow. And so, you know, we obviously have a different makeup in with regard to that. So we wouldn't have a unified approach to an inventory. County offices don't have jurisdiction over the school districts, as many of you know. We're just advisory role to our school districts. I try to help facilitate offer services to our districts when there's larger facilities needs, because as most of you know, in this kind of budget environment, many of our districts have let go of facility staff. You know, they don't have sophisticated folks. There hasn't been the budget to have folks on board. And so, you know, when I see these great inventory processes that many of these folks have gone through, it's pretty out of reach for most, if not all, of our school districts. I can think of two who have inventories that are that deep in scale.
Are you saying the capability's not there, or they don't have the software?
I'm saying the capability of having staff to input that kind of information. All of our school districts know what they have. Every one of them.
And you understand that's not what we're asking.
Right.
Exactly. We're asking
Right.
how many buildings do you have on a piece of property?
Right, and I applaud you for that, and I also applaud you, and I'm appreciative to hear that we've now are talking about bifurcating inventory from condition assessment. Although I do agree at some point in time we need to be talking about condition assessment. At this point, if we can keep the conversation directed toward, you know, if we want to know in California how many classrooms we have statewide, and we don't know in one basket where that information is, let's try to figure it out. Although I would like to say that if there's a way to, or if I could encourage you to consider starting with what you do have available from the state agencies, that probably would be exceedingly helpful to some of the smaller school districts. You can start there at least, or come up with a simple form or something of that nature. Would be really helpful. Joe Dixon mentioned the good repair reporting that's required now with local funding control. But county office, I've been doing Williams inspections now for 9 or 10 years. I was just talking to Brooks Allen about that, how long it's been. And the Williams assessments, you know, every school's been required to do those good repair reporting in their SARC report cards. Those have been required, although that's not maybe an ideal tool globally for assessments totally, but it is a form of assessment inventory, and many schools have been doing those. So overall, I think that, you know, as a county office, we're in agreement that some form of inventory is very important. I think that we all know that every district or most districts are already doing that. It's just how do you collect the information, and how do you do it in a way that doesn't require the district to do one more form of reporting. You know, align it with something else. If it's with the SARC, if it's with good repair, you know, if it's with something else that they already have to do. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm still kind of shocked by a little bit of saying, okay, you're a county board of education. You know how many schools and how many students you have. You have to report that almost on a day-to-day basis with to get your funding for ADA and all the rest of the things. And you're saying that you can't, as a county or a school district, go up and say, you know, I got 14 buildings on this site. This is how many students we have. The stuff we've been talking about. My roof's 10 years old, and my air conditioning has been in place for 32 years old. That's beyond the capabilities of the administration of each school site?
no, I'm not saying that reporting that's beyond the condition of the school districts that we have. What I'm saying is the sophisticated level of doing anything as deep as what we saw in the presentations is certainly well beyond what I know many of our school districts are capable of doing. What I understand, most of those really sophisticated facilities management programs require a sophisticated staff to manage. You can't just do them once and then leave them alone.
And the reason I bring that up
Yeah.
is not besides just having an inventory, but we're also trying to figure out need. So about some basic assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it goes beyond the age of a building, but some basic assessment that we can get idea of what the liability may be for the state, or what time and when,
Right.
then it's not very good data. So I think that, we don't need to know each window has 75% of its life left.
Right.
But we do need to know that the building's 45 years old and hasn't been repaired or a new roof put on for 22 years. And I think that's the level, and I just want to make sure we're clear here,
Yeah.
that I'm looking for. Now, the schools that I think it benefits every one of your districts, large or small, to have that assessment on their own so they can budget correctly. With all this with the new funding, the school districts are going to have to budget this stuff in on a long-term basis, not year to year, but they're going to have to look down the road for both minor and major maintenance. Otherwise, they're going to be in a world of hurt later. I don't think we're asking anything that they're not going to have to do already in this assessment. So I just want to just clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? Thank you.
There you go, see? The graceful entry.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it.
Just waking everybody
I
up.
just tried to change it up a little.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Sam Wilson. I'm the National K-12 Operations Leader for my firm, and I'm here with my colleague, Joe Clark. He's Vice President of Educational Services for his company, and together we sometimes work together and we often compete against each other. So we're really here as colleagues to just answer any questions and provide some input. Together, our two firms have done 12 statewide assessments for K-12 school district, state operations across the country. So that's a pretty significant body of work. Additionally, we've worked in all 50 states. Myself personally and my team, we've been involved in 1 in 8 assessments and capital planning for 1 in 8 public schools in the country. So we've seen a real broad variety of best practices and lessons learned and what works and doesn't work. So today, we're really here to talk about the statewide assessments, and those come in as just about as many forms as there are assessments. So every one of them are pretty radically unique. They also have very different team makeups and how they gather the data, how they process it, the software tools they use, and the way that they involve the districts is often quite different. So in some of these, it's district reported, and some of these, it's data collected by professional teams. So there's a pretty wide range there. We wanted to just highlight really 3 statewide assessments because we believe it really spans the spectrum of the types of assessments that we see across the country. And one of those is the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So in 2006, the Commonwealth created the Massachusetts School Building Authority, which was spun off from the Department of Education, and they basically had no inventory of their schools.
Right.
We literally had to go to the website and download the schools off the website. So that assessment in 2006 was about 1.5 cents per square foot, and it turned into what I think you're really talking about, which was primarily a portfolio inventory of all their schools. They then came back in 2010 and redid that assessment where they collected the need associated with those schools really at 4 primary levels. They looked at roofs, windows, HVAC, and boilers. So those were very specific purposes, and they used that to help justify and validate the funding requests from districts in the Commonwealth that applied for state reimbursed funding. That second assessment was about 1.7 cents per square foot. We also wanted to talk to you a little bit about Colorado, where Joe's firm is involved.
In Colorado, we looked at 1,800 different schools across the state for a statewide space inventory system. Included in that, we also looked at education technology, preparation of 21st century schools. We looked at educational suitability, which is another component, condition assessments, those kinds of things. That study then drove funding through a grant process where it required the individual districts to use that data that was provided by the state. I think something that you're alluding to, how can we repurpose this data and make it more valuable for districts, and create a facility master plan for submission to get that funding. So the inventory system was really the starting point in Colorado, and then the assessments continued to follow after that so that they could build this portfolio of information to submit their facility master plans for funding.
The last one is Hawaii, and that's, I believe, the only state that's currently underway in a statewide assessment right now. And Hawaii is a little bit unique. As you pointed out, that's a pretty small district. They've got about 256 schools. It is one, though, that it's a statewide district, and it's being driven by the Department of Education. So I do think there's some parallels. One of the interesting things there is that they're also addressing 21st century schools in a very big way, and in how they remodel their schools and modernize their schools beyond just fixing the infrastructure they have, but what they really think schools will be in the next 5 to 10 years. And they're looking at public-private partnerships to help them fund that. So there's some interesting parallels. Interestingly enough, while the Massachusetts assessments were in the 1.5 cent range, Hawaii is a very expensive study because it involves pretty extensive community engagement, and it's about 15 cents a foot. So there's a pretty wide spectrum of what you can do and how you go about that. We really wanted to just address 5 kind of suggestions, if not lessons learned from that quickly. And one of those is, as we've heard here today, it's really important to define the level of detail and the types of inventory that you're going to try to collect. At some point, there's a gross square footage per building, which some of these sheets have highlighted. You can also go to the room level. So when we talk about Archibus and linkages to CAD and CAFM systems, that is a very detailed assessment. So it's really important to define that level and understand how you're going to use that data in helping you make that determination.
Approach methodologies. We've heard a lot of approaches from San Diego and LA that were pretty sophisticated. I think the Kern County Office of Education representative that was just up here speaking about small districts. My background, I spent 7 years in school districts. I spent 7 years at the Department of Education in the state of Washington, so I can give you some background on that system if you'd like. Spent a couple years at the U.S. Department of Ed. And one of the things that's really critical is the collect versus submit component here. If we collect this information, either in a model like LA or San Diego is doing it with professionals in those disciplines, or we send assessors out into smaller districts so you have kind of that third-party objectivity versus submit data where we build a form on a website and everybody submits, the quality of your data, we've learned, improves dramatically through the collection versus the submission process. And as you further tie that to funding, it's amazing the differences in data that you'll get because of the importance of that information. Transparency versus accountability. We also want to look at is the system really designed for accountability or is it designed for transparency? Looked at some of the fields that you've looked at. I think those are a good starting point. There may be some additional ones. There may be some clarification on where the data is coming from that you've already asked for in terms of your field definitions here. And then another point, ability versus capacity. Really, I think when you have an LA Unified, you have a San Diego, they've got a SQL backend. They can port that to a text-limited file. They can import it up to a website. You can use web services like the Fusion folks we're talking about. Absolutely unbelievable. Small district, 15, 20 buildings. Someone's got to sit down and bring all that data together. That is where the benefit of an inventory system like this, where it's very uniform, very concise, very specific, but they don't have to create it on their own and then bring that data forward. It's already defined for them.
And forgive me, gentlemen, but this more sounds like an RFP presentation than it does for an informational hearing. I'm not in that stage yet of seeing which the best vendor is or what it should cost or anything like that. We're trying to figure out the data points for it. But since you're making a presentation like that, what would you suspect if one of your firms did this, what the statewide cost would be?
Yeah, it just widely depends on what you're trying to do. I don't think that you need anywhere near a 15 cent a foot type of assessment. So my guess is that you'd be down in the 1 to 2 cents a foot range because I think you really need a very high level kind of look at it. And what we're really trying to think about is how you would structure this data. One of the other considerations is how you maintain this data going forward. So if you collect this data, now you got to figure out, do the districts maintain that? In the state of Arkansas, the districts maintain that through a web interface on an annual basis. Does the state maintain that? That's another consideration.
My reaction was the same as Senator Hagman's. We're not here to deal with vendors or whatever. I mean, I'm not going to elaborate on my comments, but we're here to hear what some of the districts were doing. We're looking at, whether or not we move forward with requiring, the next bond, a high-level system. So
our intent was really strictly to provide some other states that we've worked in and some of the information around.
And I've actually looked into Massachusetts and Colorado, but again, we're not at that level of detail right now. So thank you.
Okay.
Francis. It's okay, I had the same thought.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Vincent. I'm a Deputy Director of UC Berkeley Center for Cities and Schools. I was the lead researcher and author on this report that was referenced earlier, California's K-12 infrastructure investments. Currently, as a follow-up to this, we're doing a nationwide study of nine states, looking at their standards on educational design and space, as well as looking at their inventory and those kinds of things and their funding programs. I can tell you more about those 9 states, and that will be out in the fall. But a lot of these states that we're looking at, 7 of them have conditions assessments and inventories. And what I want to do is be very brief because I know we all want to leave.
We have one more item on our agenda too. So.
I will be even briefer. But provide some of the lessons learned that we are finding in the research on this, and we're doing detailed statutory and regulatory review of these states, as well as doing interviews of Kathleen Moore and Lisa Silverman types in these other states in those positions. One is that I'm glad to hear that we're kind of here getting clear on our terminology. That is the difference between a basic space inventory versus a conditions assessment versus what we're starting to see in some of these other states also, which is what I would call an educational suitability assessment, right? And those are long-term types of things, so it's good to see that. As the previous speakers mentioned, these states completely vary, absolutely, totally, but the important thing is that what they collect and why they collect it is explicitly tied to their funding approach, what they fund and what they don't fund. There's a logic there. But many of these states, most of these 9 that we're looking at, require this, particularly the basic inventory and a few metrics on conditions assessment, require these often annually, but require them in facility master plans, right? So they're not disconnected in this inventory, they're actually inside of a plan. And it appears to be in many of these.
What level of facility master plans do they do? Because I participated on dozens of facility master plan committees, and boy, you can really,
right.
You can have very high level conceptual, you can be in the weeds on them and spend millions of dollars per site developing them.
Absolutely.
So what level of
what it appears that there's a real struggle in most states between what's required and what are guidelines. Most of these states, as we do, have very detailed guidelines, quote unquote, of what should be included in that plan, and so there's explicit metrics around facility condition. The other thing is that speaking with these directors, they caution about the often limited sort of ongoing and dynamic usefulness of just a snapshot in time. So their stress is like, how does this bubble up from the local level? And so with that, I would just kind of summarize or end by making kind of 3 suggestions based on what you hear. And the nice thing is this kind of reiterates a few things that have been said here. One is I think we should keep it simple. I think we should start with a basic inventory. I would agree with Mr. Dixon's comments based on the forms that have been turned in over the years within the school facility program that if we wanted to, and we took the data at DSA, information at DSA, it's not digitized, unfortunately, most of it, at OPSC and CDE, we would probably have 60 to 80% of a statewide basic space inventory. And what I've seen other states do is they do that, put it up, they know it's not full and complete, and they say, please fix it. And people can log in and do that. The second thing is I think that we should absolutely be thinking about this as a state-local partnership. I think that goes in line with the ethos of the school facilities program and what you all are talking about. So primarily it would be used as a planning tool for locals, and the state should help support that, particularly for these middle districts that would like to be doing this but can't. And then secondarily to inform state allocation. And so this really, doesn't mean that the state lines up from from worst to best, the facilities, and ticks down the list. But what we're seeing in the Massachusetts and some of these other states is that they're saying, oh, you're bringing this project for modernization. Based on what we know about your conditions assessments from a year or 2 or 3 ago, it makes sense that this is on the list. Versus saying, oh, this is something, you have 15 other schools that rank, much more deficient on health and safety, so why are you bringing this high school forward versus these other 12? And states are able to kind of ask that question to locals, and they can respond, retaining local control, but allowing them to, basically putting the onus on them to justify why this project is going forward. And I think, too, that, one of the things that has struck me in this research, and no one's really said it here today, but there's a huge amount of distrust between local districts and the state and vice versa, et cetera. And I think that, this is going to work if local districts quote-unquote own their own data. That is, they believe it's valid, and they're updating it on a regular basis.
Well, and if they're all doing it consistently, because if
Right.
they're not, then you've got an apples to oranges comparison.
Exactly.
And the one thing I know about the state program is every district maximizes what it can get from the state program for its own district. I mean,
Sure.
it's so to say you have a true apples to apples right now, you don't necessarily have that.
And we also have to ask the question, do we need an apples-to-apples comparison? Because it really is determined by what the funding approach is from the Future of the School Facilities
Well, if you're
Program.
going to fund based on certain criteria, you would hope that that criteria is
Right.
used evenly.
Right. So I think that, let me end, and then
Yeah.
is that I think locals can certify this. But let me end by saying that, I think that we should really think about situating this within the new context of the local control funding formula, and particularly the local control accountability plans. As was mentioned previously, the law states that districts are going to have to show their plan and their budget for maintaining good repair, and it seems like we should easily be able to embed, some basic
The intent on that,
data.
I believe, though, is to not let districts off the hook for having to provide some major maintenance. I'm not sure the intent is to, anyone ever believe that right now if you're going to participate in a program, you have to commit 3%, right, of your budget towards, mostly it's spent with routine maintenance with districts. So I think the intent with that was to make sure you're still making the same effort, not necessarily to see that 3% go to 20%. So I don't know where we go with that. But this is what I struggle with, okay? If you think about the local control funding formula, okay, the governor in his proposal said, look, we have a high correlation between test scores and poverty, between test scores and whether or not students are English language learners. He didn't say in school district A and school district B, you have the same population, but school district A, you have an API of 850, and school district B, you have an API of 650. So I'm going to give more to school district B and less to school district A, because getting into that level would have been very, very difficult. And, ideally you want to figure out school district B probably should want to know what school district A was doing. But so instead he used a proxy where you have that very high correlation, and he said, okay, for students that fall into qualify for free and reduced lunch, or English language learners, or foster kids, we are going to use that as a proxy related to overall achievement, and we're going to give those students, we're going to districts 20% more for those students, and if you get your population up to 70%, we're going to give you an additional, 50 or 70% for those. And so when you look at how the state program has worked, we use age of schools as a proxy for when they need to be modernized. Because when in a state as big as California, to try and get into exactly, what kind of construction you have on every school, or, and whether or not school A is in a little bit worse shape than school B or whatever, it makes it difficult. So and the governor wants us to simplify. So the question is how do we, just like with the local control funding formula, what do we use as our proxies or yardsticks to be able then to give these grants to districts and then let them make local decisions? And so you got to decide how complex you want to get it or how simple you want it to be. And of course, it's been sort of, the whole streamlining that took place when Prop 39 passed and the other legislation was to go with a simpler approach. And I don't know how we balance the two. I myself, you can hear from all my comments, believe that probably, we're going to have to trust districts and boards to do these kinds of assessments, but we're going to need a simpler approach at the state level and hopefully incentivize some of the right decisions. But I don't know how we get too much in the weeds without getting to the point where we spend so much money administering, we're taking away money from projects that are really improving schools.
I would agree, and I'm glad you asked the question.
Yeah.
Maybe we should shift to the state funds capital renewals and gets out of the process of funding capital. I don't know.
Well, the state's
It's a
not
question.
the state's not going to, if anything, I
Right.
mean, if you read the budget a year ago, January, it was getting the state completely out of the business.
Right.
So if anyone thinks that the state's suddenly going to take on all of that, we're not. So the question is how do we have a simple program that helps incentivize locals to raise money and helps us improve schools?
I completely agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Kathy Allen, Sacramento City Unified School District. Just a couple of comments, and you've heard this over and over again, but I will append to it, that the state agencies do have an awful lot of this data already. I think we've kind of all acknowledged that. One of my concerns is, as we've gone around and around on this, is the accuracy of the data. And it was very interesting during Mr. Zian's presentation earlier about back in the early 90s, that we started this and then we ended up with something that wasn't really usable, and that's just about the time I started getting into this business. So I had not heard that data before. So I'm very concerned that we don't set up something that's going to cause us to fail again. It takes a lot of effort, as we've all mentioned, to produce the data or report it, whether it's rolled up or rolled down. I want to make sure that it's something that's usable. The other thing I'd like to say is that with the data that the state agencies have, and I go back to the date we all got the AB 300 list, and we're all looking for our schools to see, if we're on there, and we're, if we found something that was wrong, it was like, oh wow, we got to fix that. It was very hard to fix. So if we push all this data up, and it gets tied later on to a project at DSA, and DSA says that's not what I've got on my list, now I'm back down to trying to fix that again, versus if we start off with what they have, and then maybe we can fix it now. We might start with a little bit cleaner plate. So those are my only two comments. Thanks.
Can I ask you, you have a database that you use right now for facilities maintenance?
We have a master plan, and we have many different databases. We don't have one full district-wide. I have parts and pieces, and some folks keep it on Excel, some folks keep it on something else, but I don't have one single database.
And I understand that Cash is pushing the use of state data talking points up here, but we've heard from the same presentations that, we demolished this portable, we moved this one, moved that one. Why would anyone think the DSA's plans from 30-plus years ago would be any close to being accurate? Why would you start off with, on this talking point, that 30, 40-year-old blueprints rolled up in DSA's thing would be close to anything but accurate to start off with, versus what you have currently in your inventory that you probably have some kind of system to give us a copy of?
I think some of us would, and most of us probably wouldn't. So again, it's a starting point. It may not be the best starting point, but it is a starting point. And it is an agency that we have to consistently share things with, and I don't want to say prove things, but verify. We have to verify a lot of things with that agency. So again, I go back to the day the AB 300 list came out, and we were all very quick to want to fix things, and it was quite difficult. So,
well, my comment is this: when I look at the list, and obviously we can make more reports or more copies, or maybe if you email Ms. Morris, she can send this to you. But I mean, the information they're asking for is modest, and right now to be eligible, I mean, if you think of our eligibility system, we're supposed to be matching up how many classrooms you have to how many students you have, and figuring out what capacity is. I don't see, in terms of this list, I don't see where we're asking for that much more information. And at some point in time, I had someone at a high level say, well, we've spent all this money in the last decade. Have we caught up? Do we really still have need? And I can't tell you how many classrooms we have. I can't tell you how many schools we have. I can't tell you how old they are. I don't want the detailed information that San Diego and LA have, but in terms of Mr. Vincent's comment, I mean, it's there, so the condition. I believe individual districts are going to have to take responsibility for that. But in terms of having some sort of a space or inventory there, I just fail to see how it's that unreasonable. And you know, it's, like I said, this is not, when you look at this, and maybe, you know, I would suggest you take a look at it, it really is, I think the information is relatively modest, and I don't see where, again, I agree with Mr. Hagman, having someone at DSA go through blueprints that are maybe 30 years old, I just can't see where that's a good use of anyone's time or money.
Well, I mean, to clarify, I'm not saying that it's unreasonable at all. We definitely want to provide the data. We just want to make sure we provide the right data and accurate data. So, and I haven't seen the list.
I mean, the whole concept, and I guess I still have a hard time with this when, you know, I guess it's touching my last speaker, that this partnership is not trusted on both directions. And we're about to close our side of the partnership and say you're on your own, okay? And we're on your side. We're trying to make the case that this is a good partnership, we need to go forward. But can anybody in any business scenario say, I'm going to go partner with you and not have any data whatsoever to say I'm going to be venture partnership with? And for those school districts to say, well, I don't want to give it to you, you haven't enough? It just doesn't make any sense to me. You know, there's most of the folks are saying, we're done, there's enough, all the needs have been met, let's move on. And we're trying to say, well, we believe there's more need, but we don't have any data to share with them, the ones we have to advance. So we're reaching out to you and saying, look, come help us with that data if you want this program to continue on in the future, not just the immediate need, but 5 years from now or so. And to sit there and say, well, we don't trust the state with that data, well, you may lose your business partner very quickly.
Thanks.
We have one more. Yeah. Do you have any more comments? Do you have comments to make? Okay, so we have one more item to, hopefully Kurt doesn't have a early flight.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for letting me speak, committee members and committee chair. Heather Steer, Western Placer Unified School District in Lincoln, California, about 30 minutes from here. I've spoken to you guys before, and actually, since I have the speaker, I was giggling when I was looking at this picture. Sorry, I'm going to use your reference here, Lee, but the picture right here of the blue building, by the way, if this is what you're thinking of when you talk about the trailer or the roll-on, I am 100% behind you on that, because that does not look like anything I would ask for funding on. So I wanted to point that out separately, but. As far as it goes, it seems like there's been a question, and I finally had to get up, of, you know, we see a lot of, now I've seen San Diego, LA Unified, examples of other states, and everybody's saying, you know, where's that smaller school district that really can't provide that information, and that's me. So I thought it would probably be valuable for me to get up.
Over again. I'll just say.
I don't have the list, so I don't know.
The list, and is really simple. Your CDS code. School name, school location, school type, elementary, middle, high, grades, enrollment, area of site, total area of buildings, number of buildings, status, site energy use, which we could include that or not include it, depending on the system. Yeah. And then for the building, you know, it's just the building numeric designation, class, building use, area, number of stories, year built, which I would say built/renovated, because we want probably both. Okay. Number of classrooms or teaching stations, grade levels, and type of construction. It's a very...
I can get you about 50% of that data.
Well, then...
And I'll tell you why, because I know you guys are probably curious as to know why. We are an old rural district. We were the rural district that exploded. It exploded without, as many do, you don't necessarily have the funding for staff. There was no facility staff until 2006. Can you give us
an example of the type of information you can't provide?
That I cannot provide? When you talk about total building areas, when you say, you know, 30-year-old plans rolled up in somewhere, it probably aren't going to help you much. That's pretty much what I can have if I can find those. You mentioned the example of the district you were in. You know, good luck finding the original as-built on buildings. I have lots of renovations that I can't find any plans on. I don't know when they were last renovated. I don't know when roofs last went on. Records were not kept by old staff. It wasn't something they ever did. Nothing is on PDF. Nothing is on computer.
I could probably walk most buildings and say they're 30 feet wide and however many feet long.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I could throw a stab at it, but I mean, you know, I can shoot it with a gun. But if I could qualify that, when you say, well, we need to go out then and get that information, and you could probably walk it, and you probably could, but I'm a staff of one. I don't have any staff to go out. And I don't have any district money to hire consultants or staff to go out to do that. We have 3 maintenance workers for our entire district, and that includes grounds and all of our maintenance. We don't have trades workers. So we have 3 maintenance people. So I can't even ask the maintenance department to go out and do
How do you file your
that.
projects with the state?
What do you mean?
Do you file projects with the state?
Yes, we did in 2000.
And who does that work?
I have to do that work when we do it.
How many schools do you have?
We have 11. And a school farm.
And for emergency planning with your local police, for insurance purposes, you have to list your square footage for insurance. For giving reports to a board member to say, I need this much money to paint my building, how do you do that without having some of this information?
Our inventory list that we have on file is antiquated. We have a considerable rollover every single time we have to go through fixed assets. And every single time I always put the question mark of, I guess, if that's what we had before, I don't know. We even had a lot of work when you talked about removing portables. Well, if you guys know when you remove portables or added them, I often don't. In fact, we have portables that are giant question marks. They don't even have numbers on them. I'm trying to do closeouts on buildings that I can't even find any information.
I'm willing to bet you if I went into any of the schools in my district, I could walk into the office and there would be a site plan of the school that would tell me how many buildings, that I could look at that and say how many buildings there are, add up how many classrooms, because we know what the classrooms are, because they do that to have, the little dotted lines to show where you go if you exit a building or whatever. So I would think most principals could tell you how many buildings and how many classrooms they have and how they're used.
I guess I would just ask, as we move through this issue, and I think you can see that there is support for an inventory, is maybe turning it around to how can it work for you? So look at the list or go back and determine what information that we may need at the state level to make good decisions would also help you at the local level to make good decisions. And how can we work together to have something that works both here and with you. Completely understand you're a department of one. So help us figure out how to make it work for districts like you or LEAs like you so that it can, that we can move forward with this issue.
Well, and I don't want you to think of coming up as an anti-inventory, because I'm actually a pro. I've always been a pro inventory. In fact, I'm trying to, I don't know how well it's going to work, integrate a little bit of that in a master plan update. As you said, a lot of them sheltered under a master plan. So it's not going to be very specific. But when I start hearing comments of as we talked about, and I think Jenny used the word bifurcating it from the assessment, I can walk down and go, well, I've got 5 classrooms, and they're usually about 960, but then I'm going to be getting you not exact data. If I had a wish, if they said that, in fact, that was actually one of the things I asked for when I first started, and nobody could provide them. I had to go to each site and collect those fire drill maps, and they're not obviously to scale. So I did all that, and I would love to be able to walk into the office one day and have that information be there and be able to give it. It's just, I've already started this very slow hill climb of trying to get as much as I can. And from here forward, or from when I started forward, it's very easy, but it's the older stuff, as you mentioned, that's hard. It's almost like I want to just make sure that as we go forward with this for districts like myself, or for, even Sac City Unified, when I heard Kathy say she's got it on various places and, trying to put that all together, is that it's just really a little bit more of, we're making sure we're making a slow and reasonable climb toward it, and that people have the ability.
Maybe, because I know that there's information that has to be provided just to get eligibility to participate in the state program, some of the stuff that we're talking about. So maybe, as Ms. Moore suggested, you can go back and look at the information on this report, if this were where we were to start gathering information, and think a little bit about what would be involved if you did have to provide that information. That would be very helpful.
Do you want me just to send that to you guys? I'd be happy to do that.
That'd be great. The more
Absolutely.
information we have, the better.
Yeah,
Thank
I'd love
you.
to do that. Anything else I can provide?
I just wanted to also point out to the board members that on the school site information, on the 11 items, actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them can be linked to the CDS code. So the district wouldn't have to say,
Right.
do anything.
Right.
They put their CDS code in, and
Right.
it could auto-populate that
Auto-populate,
part.
right.
It's the other pieces that,
Right. And some of the information we probably have in our system.
well, your year-built renovated, you
That's
might
right.
be able
That's
to pull
exactly
from
right.
OPSC renovated.
Right. Yeah.
So that's that integration piece I think a lot of people
And
are
I
talking
understand
about.
that we might be off by a year or two on something where someone isn't sure, but over time, as you upgrade. But if you could go back and take a look at this and give some thought, that would be great. And I want to wrap
Thank you
this
so
up
much.
really soon because we still have one more item, and we've been here for on this one. We've been on this one for, 3 hours? But
Good afternoon. Richard Gonzalez, Capital Advisors. To your list, item 11. I don't see a need for it right here at this point in time for
Right.
high elevation view. So that'd be my primary point there.
Right,
And
and
it's a
there's different Prop 39 requirements, and some districts may be on a central system and have that or not, but I'm not, Prop 11 isn't at the top of my priority list, but this is just a list that someone came up with as a beginning point.
As a group, as I said, at the we've gathered a group together at the Department of Education because this was a recommendation in the UC Berkeley report to try and begin the process. So it's a beginning process point.
I want to parrot what others have said, and for that matter, what I see here. This list is a good list. It's a great place to start. I think you've got the workings for it. There are issues, one small issue that this young lady just brought up. Prior to 1998, every application that came into the State Allocation Board through OPSC or OLA at the time had to have what's called 1A, 2As, and 3A drawings. Okay? Since that has stopped being a requirement, most districts are not even having those documents available. They're not even up to date. I've had several cases where I've gone to try and find out what's the age of this building, what's the age, and some of these districts have very good, what would be perceived to be very good record keeping, files and plans and all sorts of things, and yet I still found buildings that I could not find a true age to. All right? So that's one problem. The other is that sometimes these districts go out and they do modernization, and it's a pot shot here, a pot shot there. One project's just the toilets. Or under the old lease purchase program, there was a line of construction. You can only do classrooms up to that point in place. And sometimes that information gets lost over time and history, or you end up with little pockets of within an existing building of one room or another being modernized. So the original year built, great. If you've got years in which there was modernization in that building without specifying the specific space maybe, then I think that would be valuable.
Thank you, and I'm sure if we do end up moving forward, there will be discussion on what purpose. I've got to move on. I've got to go to the, I need to go to the next agenda item. Yeah, good. I want to move on. I want to thank everyone for your comments and for your indulgence, and I would like to move on to the charter school item here. Thank you. Sure. Oh, we have charter school stuff here.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara Kampminer with the Office of Public School Construction. For this item, the Office of Public School Construction has put together some program statistics on the charter school facilities program. Since this is a follow-up discussion, we don't have a ton of the detailed information about how the program works, but just as a quick reminder, the program operates with the preliminary apportionment first for charter schools, which reserves the bond authority, and then the program converts the project to a final apportionment. So I'm using the term conversion in these statistics. Anytime you see that, that means that the charter school has taken their concept and moved it forward to where they have state agency approvals, and that's what a lot of these statistics look at. I'm actually going to start on page 28 of the item, the second page, and on the top chart there, there's just an overview of the status of the preliminary apportionments in the program. There were 81 preliminary apportionments, and they are in various stages right now. And right now, there are still projects and filing rounds that are active, so not all the projects have hit their statutory deadlines of 4 years with the possible 1-year extension. So we still have 28 projects that are active in the program. Of the preliminary apportionments, 34 have already converted to a final apportionment, and we've had 19 rescissions. One thing to point out is the fiscal crisis did hit in the middle of the charter school facilities program, and that did have an impact on the cash available to charter schools. And since they don't have access to a lot of other funding for their local match, many of the projects were unable to move forward until the State Allocation Board took some actions to try to get the advance funding for charter schools available during the time of the fiscal crisis and place that on the unfunded list. So there were some hiccups in the timing of the program. So down at the bottom of page 28, we've identified the timing to convert from preliminary to final as being an average of 4.63 years, but that is with the fiscal crisis timeframes in there. And
So
then
are you saying, Barbara, that that was a good time frame then, if everyone was able, they were able to convert within that 5 years?
People were still able to convert even with the fiscal crisis coming in there. I think one of the main points is that we don't necessarily have true outcome data on this program yet because it's still a little bit early. Not all the projects have converted. And then the last page of our item deals with the specific circumstances that each filing round dealt with. So we don't have a good, clean filing round from start to finish that didn't have some sort of environmental impact that hit. We had, for instance, we had the fiscal crisis hit, which interfered with the ability for charter schools to get the advance funds to move the projects forward within the time frame. With the round that was done with the bond funds from Proposition 55, the program was structured so that there were project caps on the amount of the preliminary apportionment. So there were many charter schools that realized that the project caps were preventing the projects from moving forward. So there was a time period where people waited to figure out what was going to happen, and then the project started moving again once the board took action to make some regulatory changes to make the amounts that charter schools would receive more on par with what school districts would receive. So there was a little hiccup in the timing there. The latest filing round started when funds were frozen, the timelines were frozen, so things weren't even counted. So it's really hard to measure if folks are coming in within the 4 to 5 years. So we've tried to get at it a couple ways, but you have to take into consideration the environmental factors as well. On page 29 and 30, what we've tried to do is look at the types of charter projects, and we've broken them down a couple of different ways. The pie chart on the top of page 29 shows the projects that did convert, the successful conversions, and what types of organizations converted the applications. Now, we're using terms like educational management organization, independent charter school, dependent charter school. These are loose terms. They're not strictly defined, but they're sort of common working knowledge of who these folks are. But you'll see a breakdown. The district-dependent charter schools, you'll only see 4 there, but we didn't have a lot of applications in the program from the district-dependent charter schools. But with the EMOs and the independent charter schools, it's about 50-50 about how they're converting. And then most of the projects that have converted so far have taken advantage of the full matching loan that the state provides for the matching share requirement. On page 30, we start to look at projects that rescinded to see if there are any trends in there, and that pie chart at the top shows the breakdown of reasons why projects rescinded. Some of the highlights, we did have several schools that received SFP funding through another source, so they may not have converted under the Charter School Facilities Program, but they were able to successfully work with their local school district and participate in another school facility program. So not necessarily a failure of the project, just a switch in which bond source they were using. We did have others that sought funding from an outside source because it made more sense for the project. Upon occasion, folks encountered good private financing options that made more sense for the particular project. And for those that were unable to meet program requirements, for half that group, it was a desire to locate the project outside of the area that had generated the eligibility. So more of a choice as opposed to a stumbling block potentially in the program requirements. And then the other thing, we wanted to follow up on some questions that came up on the January board meeting as to whether the distribution system that was outlined in the statute for how the bond authority was spread with the charter schools worked, and also whether the inflator factor, which is designed to account for the time lapse between the preliminary apportionment and the final apportionment, works. And that data begins with the pie charts on page 31 and 32. And we've broken, there are 4 categories in statute that the bond authority was intended to be spread amongst different types of charter schools. And the first one was region, and then the type of locale being urban, rural, and suburban, also by grade level and school size. And then after those categories, within those categories, each project received preference points for other things such as low-income categories, nonprofit, things like that. So what we did notice in looking at these charts is that we have a lot of urban projects and a lot of Region 3 projects, and what we were able to tell from that is that for the projects that applied those areas, there was a heavy concentration of charter schools in Region 3. Also, a lot of the charter schools that applied were in areas that had the high free and reduced lunch percentages, so that's one of the reasons that you're seeing a large portion of the charter school funding going there.
So I don't want to interrupt entirely, but some of the charter school folks have to leave at 5, so maybe what we can do, I think everyone's probably looked at this anyway, maybe if you could come up and provide input, and Barbara, I apologize, and then we'll go back and go to additional questions. And I apologize, we didn't expect the last item to go quite so long.
Quite all right. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and members of the subcommittee. We do apologize. We have an unavoidable conflict, but we'll do our best to be very succinct and would be more than happy to come back at your convenience to fill in additional detail. What we really wanted to do today, as succinctly as possible, was to give you a little bit of a context of how the state bond program fits into the variety of facility solutions that are accessible to charter schools and how that impacts charters differentially, especially in the context of their life cycle. Unlike district schools, of course, charters are subject to renewal every 5 years. And we have a tremendously robust movement, even though the official figures aren't out right now. We are looking at around 1,200 charter schools operating as of 13-14. Enrolling close to 10% of the state's public school students, and close to about 500,000 students across the state. And of those, interestingly, about 106 are new this year. 650 or so are 5 years or more older. And about 400 or so are 10 years old and more, which does present a variety of opportunities as well as challenges for schools that are just starting out without any, if you will, history, academic record, a provable track record of fiscal responsibility, if you will, and different options become available as they become more mature. So, right now, the landscape for charters, as a charter school just becomes first authorized, they literally have only 2 functional options. One is to have access to Prop 39, which is, of course, the provision whereby a district where the charter is located has the obligation to provide reasonably equivalent facilities to the students in the charter. Within that option, the district only has obligation to provide space for the students that reside within the district, not the students that come outside under the choice provisions. And therefore, the space allocation is calculated accordingly. Those Prop 39 agreements essentially are year-to-year agreements, and it's typically a choice that a brand new charter school attempts to access on its first authorization as it submits its charter petition prior to the November 1st deadline. Barring Prop 39 options, the other option is, of course, leasing a private facility at fair market value, which can, of course, vary tremendously by location, not only in terms of price, but in terms of access and the ability and the usability of the space as an educational facility. In order for a charter school, especially a very young charter school, to pay for those private facilities, they do have access to 2 programs. One is the SB 740 program administered by the state, and the Federal Facilities Incentive Grant Program. But both of those really are very specific in their targeting. They're really designed for charter schools that are enrolling 70% and above of free and reduced lunch students.
That's changing next year, right?
Not yet, but yes, and thank you so much for working with us on that issue. We really do appreciate that. That's incredibly important to expand that eligibility. The charter schools that access these funds cannot then use these funds to pay for Prop 39 enabled facilities. If there's a thread to what we're trying to accomplish here is to paint a picture of how the interlocking and sometimes competing patchwork of facility solutions interact in the charter space and provide an opportunity for us to make the bond program more robust. The more mature charters, and again, really only the charter schools that have a demonstrated longevity, usually after their second renewal, often, may have access to private financing options for to buy a facility, to build a facility, to access a bond program in a more intentional way. For those programs, there does exist the state's credit enhancement grant program, which funds debt service, but it's an extremely small program right now. It is capped right now at $1.5 million per project, and the total pot of money is $8.3 million. So you can imagine how very little impact this particular solution has. There are some issues again around how charters are impacted in their quest for a reasonable and appropriate educational facilities. We do not have independent bonding authority. So the fact of it is that even though districts can include charters in their local bonds, it simply hasn't translated into an actual material reality. In 2012, for example, 98 bonds were put to the voters, 84 of those passed, and of those, only 43 of those districts that passed bonds have charters active within their portfolio. Only 2 explicitly included charters in their bonds, and that would be San Diego and Eastside Union High. Of course, there are other challenges as well, because there aren't dedicated funding streams specific to facilities outside of the grant, which has the restrictions that we mentioned earlier. Charters essentially have to pay for their facilities costs out of their general fund. And interestingly, we've been very aggressively collecting data from our charters across the state for a number of years. But we were also pleased that recently, as part of a multi-state federally funded survey, it confirmed our findings that essentially charters right now are paying anywhere in the range between 10% and 12% of their general ADA to pay for their facilities costs, and with some outliers as high as 30% or more.
Can you advise how much of your general ADA comes from philanthropic donations?
It is somewhat uneven in terms of the kinds of schools. Certainly there are some standalone schools that are very well supported by philanthropy. Certainly some of the more prominent charter management organizations do enjoy some philanthropic support, but we have indexed that overall statewide at an average of about 10 to 12%. Across the state, with huge variation.
The same percentage. As a member of the California School Finance Authority Board, we see, as they come forward for their fiscal soundness, that there seems to be tremendous contributions of private sources.
Sure. And like I said, it's fairly unevenly distributed. Certainly a rural charter school has as many differences with an urban CMO school as a traditional public school, rural school has with an urban in Los Angeles, for example, or another urban district. Let's talk specifically about the bond program itself. Obviously, this is really our long-term objective should be to encourage as many charter schools to get out of permanent tenancy and to have access to long-term facility solutions that are adequate, that are adequate to the educational program and conducive to good learning.
In that long term, then, to be in schools that meet the Field Act and the engineering requirements of of traditional schools?
Well, certainly, if you're building schools with bond money, that is something that the charters would want to adhere to. Certainly, because of the varying impacts of cost, location, and life cycle, building your own facility certainly requires a tremendous amount of obligation on the part of the charter, and we are absolutely committed to vetting them for financial soundness, frankly, as well as academic performance, since charters live or die by that.
When you're talking about that's the long-term goal, I mean, if a state money goes into a building and for some reason the charter ceases to operate and that reverts to the district, it seems to me you want to have a usable school at the end and not something a district can't use.
Absolutely, absolutely. In terms of the challenges that we have right now, certainly charters, because of the high cost of construction and the long-term debt obligations that doesn't always match up with their renewal cycles, certainly the matching share is an ongoing challenge to come up with that high of an amount to finance over the long term. Again, whatever they're paying back, using to pay back those capital costs do come still out of their ADA and their general fund. And the financial soundness process, while we completely agree that that a very rigorous process is necessary, is actually right now somewhat more burdensome than it needs to be, and streamlining would be a good opportunity for charters to make better use of the program. The facilities use agreements sometimes yes.
Elaborate. What is it that is onerous in that process? I mean, again, sitting on that board, seeing the projects come forward, we believe it's been a very essential part of ensuring that we're funding schools that do have the opportunity for the long haul. So what is it about that is needing?
Well, I think one of the things that we hear the most from charter schools, as we've been hearing today from districts themselves as well, is that facilities and financing does require a very specific skill set and expertise. The guidance, we believe, that can be given in advance to charter schools to be better prepared to undertake the kind of rigor that the process takes, and being very specific around timelines and forms of evidence that the schools can give can certainly would be very helpful.
So technical support.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And streamlining of timelines and guidance for sure. I'm going to jump straight through to the 4 elements that we would love to see improved on the state bond program that should be an important component for charter schools to make a better use of these opportunities and still a good judicious use of public funds. We certainly believe in proportionality that can, both in terms of how the bonds are obligated and in their use in creating equitable solutions for everyone. Streamlining, as we discussed just now, the program is somewhat complicated. Additional technical assistance and clarification in advance support for schools would be very helpful. The increased use of tools to best utilize existing school space. We know, of course, that continues to be a challenge, just on inventorying and understanding what exactly exists with districts that can help incent their inclusion of charter schools. Right now, we do have incentives for charters to use district facilities. We'd love to incentivize districts to give surplus facilities to charters in a way that will help alleviate some of the Prop 39 pressures, and at the same time make better use of these existing facilities. So additional monies and flexibility for the use of rehab monies, for example, would be really, really helpful. And of course, as much as we can use the variety of vehicles to encourage collaboration, we certainly can't legislate love, we know that. But insofar as we can create incentives and carrots to sweeten the marriage proposal, that would certainly be an incredibly helpful opportunity for charters as well. And of course, the inclusion of charters in local bonds would ultimately be fantastic. And I just realized that you don't know who I am. My name is Mirna Castrejon with the California Charter Schools Association.
So one of the things I'm trying to deal with is, you know, in terms of the program now, I mean, some of what we're talking about deals with potentially a new bond, and other doesn't. So right now, we've had somewhat of a bifurcation of funds. I assume that you would continue to support some sort of bifurcation.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, right now, you can use the charter funds to rehabilitate a school. So I assume that, I mean, when you talk about incentivizing districts, if the charter can apply for funding to rehabilitate, then that's a capability you have right now.
We do have it now, absolutely. But if we continue to, for example, to incentivize, offer preference points, being very specific around the expectation of alleviating the Prop 39 pressures, essentially making those options maybe not contingent, but certainly integrated.
Out of the charter school pot.
Yes.
Okay.
But
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, my concern with that is, as charters have to get renewed every 5 years, there has to be some kind of incentives for the school district to keep you at that physical location and not to move you around, to spend the charter school money on a school site, and then say 4 years later or 2 years your charter expires, we'll renew you, but we really want that facility, so I want to move you over here, and all of a sudden all the good facilities stay with you. So there has to be some kind of...
Absolutely.
I'd like to know how often that happens, because if a district does that, it's got to find another site for you. So, I mean, how often do you end up, I mean, I would think that would be a very...
It does happen. You're right that it happens rarely. It's a huge disruption. It certainly happens more on co-locations, for example, or on for charters that are just beginning and put in a Prop 39 request, and they have growth projections that the district can only accommodate on a year-to-year basis.
But then you're going to plan accordingly, and I can see co-locations.
Absolutely.
But in terms of you've given an entire school to a charter, and, I mean, I just don't see where districts are.
Chair, I think there's some protections in statute.
Right.
If the state bond funds go to towards charter schools, the charter school can use it until they no longer need it.
Right.
But there's some provisions in statute that require that if they no longer use it, that it goes to another successor charter school. If they're no longer available, then the district can take ownership.
Absolutely.
But there's some protections in statute currently. Again, this is just for the ones that receive state bond funds.
That's correct.
So the school district can't remove the charter school from the facilities if the state provided state bond funds.
Right,
They have to
and
be
I don't
used
see
for.
where it would be in the interest, I mean, like I said, I mean, politically, I can't imagine being on school board and getting, I mean, I can understand how, okay, you want to get started next year, this is all the space we have next year, we're going to have to work on a more permanent solution, but I just don't see where where that ends up being a true issue over.
Certainly with the bond program, we unfortunately don't have the critical mass of evidence of successful projects where we could point to one or another trend on how districts and charters behave, because it's certainly it's just not something that we've been able to access at the kind of level would we be able to provide that history. But I believe your instincts are right.
So again, we've got you support having a bifurcated amount. We've talked before where we have. I mean, we don't even know what if we get a bond through what it's going to look like.
Yes.
Period. So we've also had as hard a time identifying your need as other needs.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately the goal should be to make sure every school is adequate. And you do talk about some unique challenges that charter schools face. Is there anything?
I have a question too. I mean, we talk about local bond funding. It's going to be difficult to convince school districts to do that. I just don't see what their incentive, maybe some brownie points for us, but, what's going to make them want to do that? And since it makes it very difficult, Madam Chair, for the charters to get matching funds, and we do have the loan program, is there a better way of doing that so we can speed up the process of getting this money and getting schools built, basically?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And insofar as we can provide incentives for districts to behave differently when it comes to local bonds, that would certainly be incredibly helpful. It is a hard case to make, and so far we haven't been particularly successful, which is why we've been urging that conversation.
Districts, it's what voters will support in that district.
Absolutely.
It's a very,
It's a tricky issue.
My comment on the, we had the separate pot, but we also had kind of separate rules around that, and partially that was to give charters more time, particularly because they didn't have the ability to acquire land in quite the same manner that local education agencies or school districts do. But I also know from our work in our office that some of those deadlines moved projects along.
Yes.
And that's why I was really curious, Barbara, when Barbara was talking about the average time. It was 5 years that we had. I mean, can we shorten that to get those schools moving faster, but still be sensitive to the issues that charters face in building schools, acquiring land and building schools? I like the deadlines. I think they move the projects along. And so that's one area I'd be curious your input on.
Absolutely. I don't have any more specific items to add on that. Certainly how the charters themselves have navigated the hurdles around timelines vary based on the project. But coupling the issue of longevity, renewals, and the kind of access that schools have in a more predictable, timely way would definitely help charters get better access and frankly just have awareness. I do believe that a lot of that just seems daunting when you're also worried about renewals and enrollment and growth and managing your temporary facility solutions. That it is often a process very daunting for a small nonprofit board of folks to take on with a very long view on projects that frankly are predicated on a window that is 30 years plus.
So is there, I know you've had to sit through the whole last presentation, but when we had San Bernardino County, they talked about their districts going from a school with 8 employees to San Bernardino with 37,000. So, you think about half your school districts being, I used to think it was 1,000 or less, but someone said 2,000 or fewer students. That we have the same challenges. And I don't know what, and that's not saying it's right, but I don't know to what extent whether in traditional school districts where there could be more support from the counties or whether, your charter organization. But it seems to me that it's a challenge that's faced throughout the state if you have, a small school district. And when you go to LAUSD, even though they have more resources, if you probably spread it over the students, they're probably not spending any more per student. Their challenge is daunting at the other end. They have so many, they have
scale
a hard
changes
time
everything.
getting it around. Yeah. So I don't know. Do you have any other ideas in terms of how? You can't take over the planning. So how we sort of deal with that?
Well, certainly the collective work of our own association, and we do have dedicated facility staff, as well as the number of organizations that do offer technical assistance and support specifically on accessing facilities. It's a small, highly qualified and rarefied in their skill set group of folks, but they do exist, and we do. Do the best we can to aggregate the challenges and to help people navigate the processes. I don't know ultimately how we fix the issue of staffing, but insofar as the streamlining and in predictability, if you will, and access can be improved, that will help with the capacity problems that will probably never be completely overcome.
And for sometimes when you do in planning, to save a buck is worth as much as making the dollar.
Absolutely.
And if there's unused assets out there that we could somehow incentivize and not have to spend bond money to build something new, it's worth, if it costs me 20% to incentivize the district to let a vacant site be utilized, and it saves 80%, of the building costs and a heck of a lot of the timing and process and everything like that. So as much as, staff gives suggestions or from school districts, I know there's both a capital or facilities argument for not sharing sometimes, and there's also an operations that they have to worry about as far as pulling students out of that district. Both those are two huge barriers for charters to get their feet in the ground.
Well,
and if we could incentivize, make a win-win somehow.
The recent budget is trying to require just that. If you have, unused facilities.
The surplus property, absolutely.
It goes back to trying to figure out if they're there or not.
Well,
Yeah, that's exactly right.
that's exactly right.
We look forward to coming up with some better storyline after that's implemented.
Well, I'm sure this is a continuing conversation that's
Absolutely.
going to continue. So I will just keep talking. I appreciate your input. I don't know if anyone in the audience has any comments. I understand your issues. I just don't know what all the solutions are.
Well, we thank you for the opportunity
sure.
to come, and certainly as more questions emerge, or if there are things that you'd like us to research further.
Probably have to talk some more. I mean, like I said, it's clear that charters have to be part of the next bond. Some of the barriers, I don't know if a bond in itself,
Absolutely.
can resolve that. But we'll keep talking, and thank you very much for your patience. I know you had to leave at 5.
I
It's
did.
10 after 5. So
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. So I was saying public comment, but we also took public comment. The intent was to take it at the end of each item. I don't know if there's any public comment on the charter schools issue. If not, then I just want to thank staff for all your work that you continue to do on this. It's kind of like we're bombarded with information, but it's all good to think about all of it. And what? Well, we're working on scheduling the next meeting.
We're working on scheduling that meeting. We're trying to define it, whether or not it's going to be October 23rd between 3 and plus. Yeah. Or we'll try to toggle that either the 24th, which is a Thursday.
So
For
for
the program
those
review.
following us, the possibility of the 23rd or the 24th for
That's
the
correct.
meeting. Okay.
Yep. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.